Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, long before modern cities covered the landscape, ancient people across America were building extraordinary structures that few people today know existed. Hidden beneath forests, fields, and forgotten landscapes are massive earthworks, ancient monuments, and carefully designed sites that reveal a much more complex past than many imagine. These were not simple settlements. They were impressive feats of planning, engineering, and cooperation, created by people who understood their environment and shaped the land in remarkable ways. But over time, many of these incredible structures were abandoned, buried, or forgotten. Their stories faded beneath layers of history, leaving behind questions that researchers are still exploring today. Who built these massive ancient sites? What purpose did they serve? And what can they teach us about the civilizations that came before us? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now, start the story. Tonight, we journey into the hidden world of America's lost megastructures. The forgotten monuments that reveal the creativity, knowledge, and mysteries of ancient America. So dim the lights, relax, and join us as we uncover the secrets of a forgotten past. Beneath the vast lands of the American continent lies a tale that the pages of standard history prefer to leave untold. It's not for a lack of physical proof, nor because archaeologists haven't stumbled upon its remnants, but rather because the truths they've unearthed refuse to conform to the neat, comfortable narrative we've all been handed. Far earlier than the voyages of Columbus, far before a Spanish boot ever sank into Caribbean sands, and long before any European gaze scanned the horizon and labeled it a new world, something truly remarkable was already thriving here. Great cities had risen and crumbled on this soil, engineering marvels, shifting millions of tons of earth, unfolded over centuries without the aid of the wheel, the strength of iron, or the power of the horse. Networks of roads, vast enough to stitch together territories the size of modern nations, carved their paths across the land. Observatories of the sky mapped celestial movements with an accuracy that continues to humble scholars today. And then, for the most part, a profound silence fell. The inhabitants dispersed, the cities were abandoned, and the roads vanished beneath the encroaching wilds. The memory of it all faded so completely that when Europeans finally arrived and gazed upon the ancient earthworks, the overgrown mounds, and the ghostly outlines of plazas, avenues, and canals, they refused to believe it could be the work of the very people standing before them. They crafted myths of lost tribes and vanished races, concocting anything but the simple truth that the original peoples of this land had been building, thinking, exchanging, governing, and dreaming in ways that matched, and in some instances even exceeded, anything occurring in the old world at the time. This exploration is about those forgotten megastructures, the ones still present, half-buried and frequently misinterpreted. The ones excavated and then quietly archived in academic journals few will ever read. The ones that pose questions so unsettling that mainstream history has simply chosen to avoid them. If you are listening to this to drift into slumber, then you've found the perfect place. Get comfortable. Let the mysteries wash over you. You don't need to find any answers tonight. Just let the enigma breathe. Perhaps consider subscribing if you'd like more evenings like this one. And I'd be curious to know where you are right now and what time it is. Somewhere out there, a person is listening from a farmhouse in rural Ohio, not far from mounds that were already ancient when Rome was still a cluster of huts. Another is in a city built directly atop a civilization it has never bothered to recall. Wherever you find yourself, you are closer to this history than you might imagine. If your goal is to drift to sleep, that's precisely the purpose of these stories. Maybe you'll subscribe and let me know your location and the hour of the night. There is a ridge running along the southern edge of a tranquil Ohio county where the terrain does curious things. It rises and falls in ways that feel too deliberate for mere geology, curving in arcs that look almost architectural. Walking this ridge at twilight, when the sun casts long, low rays across the grass, the truth begins to emerge. Earthwork walls, ditches, and geometric patterns drawn across the landscape on a scale that takes your breath away. This is the Newark Earthworks, and it is one of the most astonishing creations in human history. At its zenith, roughly 2,000 years ago, this complex covered over 4 square miles of the Licking County floodplain. 4 square miles of meticulously engineered earth, including a perfect circle nearly 1,200 feet across, a square enclosure of equal size, an octagon with 8 sides each roughly 350 feet long, and a system of connecting walls and avenues stretching for miles through the surrounding landscape. The architects were the Hopewell culture, a civilization that thrived in the Ohio River Valley and beyond from approximately 100 BC to 500 AD. They left no decipherable written language, no royal genealogies carved in stone, no triumphant war monuments. Instead, they left these geometric earthworks of breathtaking precision, forged entirely with human hands, wooden tools, baskets, and a profound grasp of mathematics and astronomy that researchers are still striving to fully understand. The octagon alone stands as a masterpiece of observational astronomy, its 8 openings aligning with the 8 extreme moonrise and moonset points across the 18.6-year lunar cycle. From the center of that octagon, the moon traces a complete, predictable path across the heavens over nearly 2 decades, and the people who built Newark encoded every single position of this cycle into the geometry of their earthworks. This was not chance or happenstance. It was an act of engineering, the result of multi-generational observation and calculation passed down through their system of knowledge, refined and checked against the real sky year after year, until someone declared, "Now we are ready." And they built it by hand over years, perhaps decades, using only what the earth offered. The mathematician and archaeoastronomer Ray Hively, along with philosopher Robert Horn, spent years meticulously measuring and remeasuring the Newark earthworks in the 1980s and in subsequent studies. They discovered that the precision of the lunar alignments at Newark exceeds what could be expected from coincidence by enormous margins. The probability of these alignments being accidental is so infinitesimal that it is effectively impossible. These ancient people knew precisely what they were doing, encoding the moon's cycle into the very landscape of their homeland to endure far beyond any individual's memory. Yet here is what makes Newark even more peculiar and humbling. Its builders were not a settled urban civilization in the way we commonly imagine. They did not inhabit Newark in any permanent, dense fashion. The earthworks were almost certainly a ceremonial and civic hub, a destination that people traveled to from far and wide for gatherings, rituals, and exchanges. Imagine a people spread across hundreds of miles of river valleys and forests, living in small villages for most of the year, then periodically converging on this vast geometric temple complex. The scale of their work makes more sense when seen that way. This was not a city, but a cathedral, raised not to a god whose name we know, but to the sky, the earth, and the great cycles that govern a world where survival depended on reading nature correctly. The Hopewell were not alone, nor were theirs the only Hopewell sites. Across Ohio and into neighboring states, the landscape is dotted with hundreds of earthwork complexes, some simple, some breathtakingly complex, all sharing that same geometric vocabulary of circles, squares, and octagons, linked by long straight avenues and repeated across hundreds of miles with a consistency that implies a shared intellectual and spiritual tradition of immense sophistication. At High Bank Works near Chillicothe, another circle and octagon complex mirrors the Newark pattern, aligned to the same lunar cycle and separated by about 60 miles. At Mound City, now part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, A square enclosure contains the remains of dozens of charnel houses where the Hopewell processed and honored their dead with elaborate grave goods from across the continent. Obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the Appalachians, shark teeth and marine shells from the Gulf Coast, alligator skulls from Florida, and grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies. This Hopewell trade network, known as the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, connected peoples across most of the eastern United States and beyond. This was not occasional contact, but a functioning continental exchange system, moving materials, ideas, and probably people across thousands of miles with a regularity that speaks to something far more sophisticated than a collection of isolated villages. What were they trading all this material for? What beliefs tied together peoples from the Florida coast to the Rockies? We cannot say for certain. What we know is that for roughly 600 years this network thrived, and then it didn't. Around 500 AD, the Hopewell Interaction Sphere collapsed. The great earthwork projects ceased, the elaborate burial rituals faded, and the long-distance trade dwindled. The network went silent, and no one knows exactly why. Climate change, shifting rainfall patterns disrupting agriculture, overpopulation, internal political fragmentation, or the rise of bow and arrow technology, perhaps all contributed. The collapse of complex systems is rarely simple. But what remains clear is that what the Hopewell built and understood about the sky and sacred space was truly extraordinary. And for a long time, standard history simply pretended it hadn't happened, or worse, assumed it must have been the work of someone other than the ancestors of the indigenous peoples present at European arrival. The Mound Builder myth, the 19th century fantasy attributing all earthwork civilizations to a vanished race of white people, Israelites, Atlanteans, or anything other than Native Americans, was not just a historical embarrassment, but a deliberate act of erasure. If the mounds were built by others, then the people living on this land had no deep roots, no great history, no civilization worth respecting, making it easier to take their land. We now know definitively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the peoples Europeans encountered, confirmed through archaeology, genetics, and oral traditions. Their builders were not mysterious beings, but indigenous human beings who achieved remarkable things worth quietly contemplating in the dark. Let us travel further south and deeper into the past, to a place that reshapes our understanding of what was possible in pre-Columbian North America. In the Mississippi River Delta of northeastern Louisiana lies Poverty Point, a name of cruel irony, as nothing built there reflects poverty of any kind. Poverty Point is a site of monumental earthwork construction dating to roughly 1700 BC. Let that date settle. 1700 BC, contemporary with Egypt's New Kingdom, built around the same time as Tutankhamun's successors ruled the Nile Valley. Here, in the forested wetlands of North America, a set of earthworks was constructed on a scale ranking among the largest construction projects of the ancient world. The main feature is a series of 6 concentric ridges, semicircular in shape, arranged around a central plaza. The ridges, each about 5 to 6 feet tall, form a vast amphitheater-like structure spanning nearly 3/4 of a mile. These ridges were where people lived. Houses were built atop them to stay dry in the seasonally flooded delta. At the northwest corner, a large mound appears to represent a bird in flight when seen from above, rising about 70 feet and measuring roughly 700 feet from wingtip to wingtip. To the south lies another large mound, with smaller satellite earthworks scattered across the landscape. The total volume of earth moved at Poverty Point exceeds that of many famous structures of the ancient world, all achieved without metal tools, the wheel, or draft animals, basket load by hand. Researchers estimate the bird-shaped mound alone required moving about 320,000 cubic yards of earth. To grasp that scale, if one person worked without rest for thousands of years, it would still be an impossible task. It was done by a community, organized and motivated, sustaining a massive collective labor project over multiple generations. Yet the deepest mystery of Poverty Point lingers. We do not know who these people were in any satisfying cultural or ethnic sense. We don't know their language, political structure, or belief system. We know some things from food remains and tool technologies, and the stone use came from sources hundreds of miles away, hinting at trade networks. But the deeper questions, their beliefs, governance, and stories, remain open. Perhaps most unsettling is that Poverty Point appears to have been built very quickly. Some researchers argue the main ridge complex may have been constructed in mere decades, implying an organizational capacity staggering in its coordination of labor without evidence of elite surplus extraction. There are no palaces, no signs of a warrior aristocracy. It looks like a place built by a community for itself. Around 1100 BC, it was abandoned. People simply stopped coming. The ridges sat empty, the mounds eroded, and the forest crept back. Now let us move forward to a period on the edge of what most consider pre-Columbian North America. The American Bottom, the Mississippi River floodplain east of where St. Louis now stands, between roughly 1000 AD and 1200 AD. What happened there during those 2 centuries has been consistently understated by textbooks and remains understated today. Cahokia. There is no other word in pre-Columbian North American archaeology that carries its weight. Cahokia was a city, not a village or a ceremonial center with a small population, but a true city. At its peak, around 1100 AD, it was home to between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with the surrounding regional population possibly bringing its influence to over 40,000. To contextualize this, at that time, Cahokia was larger than London and comparable in population to Paris. It was the largest urban center north of Mexico in the pre-Columbian era and would not be surpassed in size by any North American city north of the Rio Grande until the 1800s. The largest city in what is now the United States was a Native American city that flourished 9 centuries ago, and most Americans cannot name it. Cahokia was built by the Mississippian culture, which dominated much of the southeastern and midwestern U.S. from roughly 800 AD until European contact. They were an agricultural civilization built on intensive corn cultivation, adopted from Mesoamerica and refined for northern climates, providing the surplus that powered Cahokia's growth. At its heart stood Monk's Mound, named for Trappist monks who farmed its lower terraces in the early 19th century, but built by the people of Cahokia between roughly 900 and 1100 AD in multiple phases. It rises approximately 100 feet above the plain, covers 14 acres at its base, larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza in ground footprint, with a total volume exceeding 22 million cubic feet of earth, all moved basket by hand. On its summit once stood a massive wooden building, about 105 feet long and nearly 50 feet wide, serving as the palace or temple of Cahokia's ruling power. The view from its top today, even with modern Collinsville surrounding the park, conveys something of what it must have been like in 1100 AD. Miles of visibility, the entire community spread below, thousands of thatched roofs, other earthen mounds in every direction, and the great central plaza like an enormous stage. A person standing there would have had no reason to imagine the world would forget this. No way of knowing that within centuries the city would be empty, its name lost, and the people living on this same land ignorant of its meaning. Around Monk's Mound and the central plaza, dozens of other mounds were arranged in a complex spatial pattern that archaeologists have worked to decode for over a century. Some platform mounds supporting elite homes, others conical burial mounds for ruling class ceremonies. The most famous conical mound at Cahokia is Mound 72, excavated in the 1960s and 1970s by archaeologist Melvin Fowler. Inside, he found the remains of over 270 individuals, mostly young women, arranged in mass graves suggesting ritual sacrifice on a significant scale. At the center, a high-status male was buried on a platform of 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in a falcon shape, with 4 decapitated men nearby and more mass graves of young women flanking the central burial. This paints a picture of a civilization with a ruling class capable of commanding not just labor, but lives in service of ideology. Not a simple egalitarian community, but one with hierarchies that had teeth. The city was also surrounded by a massive wooden stockade, a palisade wall enclosing the central precinct, rebuilt multiple times, requiring an estimated 20,000 large logs, suggesting the threat it addressed never fully disappeared. Cahokia lived in a world of competition and conflict. One of its most remarkable features, not recognized for decades, was what aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar revealed. Hundreds of large circular features, traces of wooden post circles, the largest being Woodhenge, consisting of up to 48 large red cedar posts arranged in a circle several hundred feet across. Like Newark, Woodhenge aligned with astronomical events, specifically the equinoxes and solstices. Standing at its center on the spring equinox, the sun rises directly over Monk's Mound. This was cosmology made physical, the city oriented to the sky, and the sky made part of its meaning. Then, in the early 1200s, Cahokia began to decline. Population dropped, monument construction slowed and stopped, and people began to leave. By 1350, the city was largely abandoned, the great mounds empty, the plaza overgrown, the palisade in ruins. By the time Europeans arrived in the 1500s and 1600s, they found mounds but not the city. Descendants of the Mississippian culture scattered in smaller settlements, but the memory of Cahokia as a specific place had faded. The reasons for Cahokia's collapse are intensely debated. Climate was a factor. Its peak coincided with the medieval warm period, favorable for agriculture, while its decline coincided with the onset of the Little Ice Age, bringing cooling and instability disrupting corn production. Deforestation was another factor. The enormous demand for timber stripped the landscape, leading to erosion and flooding. Internal political tensions, perhaps worsened by elite commoner gaps, may have played a role, along with epidemics, drought, and warfare. Whatever the combination, the result was the same. The largest city north of Mexico quietly emptied, and the world moved on. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico lies a canyon most Americans will never visit, at around 6,000 feet elevation, in a landscape hostile to large-scale settlement. Very little water, brutal winters, scorching summers, thin soil, barely enough annual rainfall to grow corn. Yet between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, a civilization built something here that defies easy explanation. Chaco Canyon. The Chaco system is perhaps the most discussed and debated architectural mystery in North American archaeology. Its central features are the Great Houses, massive multi-story stone structures with no real parallel in the pre-Columbian world north of Mexico. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, is D-shaped, rising 4 to 5 stories at its tallest point, containing over 650 rooms around a central plaza. Its back wall runs in a nearly perfect east-west orientation. Its construction spanning centuries with deliberate coherence, suggesting more than ad hoc expansion. It was an architectural statement, a physical articulation of cosmology and social order made permanent in stone. The masonry is extraordinary, using a core veneer technique with precisely shaped sandstone tablets in repeating patterns. Different Chacoan buildings display different masonry styles, suggesting intentional aesthetic choices. Sandstone was quarried locally, but the timber used to roof the great houses came from mountain forests 30 to 50 miles away. Hundreds of thousands of large ponderosa pine and spruce beams cut and carried by hand across the desert, without wheeled vehicles, horses, or metal tools. every beam on human shoulders. Dendrochronology has dated these timbers with remarkable precision. But the most peculiar logistical achievement is the road system. Running outward from Chaco Canyon in multiple directions, these roads are straight, rigidly unervingly straight, cutting through terrain rather than circumventing it, using stairs cut into rock faces where necessary. Typically about 30 feet wide, cleared of vegetation and rocks, often bordered by low earthen berms. They extend for tens to hundreds of miles. The North Road running almost 50 miles due north with barely a degree of deviation. The roads form a deliberate spatial network oriented around Chaco Canyon as a hub. They are overdetermined for practical function. You wouldn't need 30-foot wide, perfectly straight roads or cliffside stairs if they were merely trade routes. The straightness itself seems to have been the point, a physical manifestation of Chacoan cosmology, a map of sacred relationships drawn at full scale. Others suggest they connected great houses to smaller outlier communities, serving as infrastructure for political and economic integration. Whatever their purpose, the investment of labor was immense. Hundreds of miles of desert road cleared by hand. And the Chaco system was vast, with over 200 outliers documented across much of the Four Corners region, connected by the road network. This was not a collection of isolated villages, but a regional-scale system with Chaco Canyon at its center. What was Chaco? The question haunts the field, whether it was primarily a ritual and pilgrimage center drawing people for ceremonies, or a genuine political capital extracting surplus. The truth likely lies between these poles. The canyon itself was never densely populated. The great houses are full of rooms, but many show no signs of regular habitation. They were ceremonial spaces, storage facilities, venues for periodic gatherings. The permanent population was probably only a few hundred people, far smaller than the architectural scale suggests. But during great gatherings, the canyon may have hosted thousands. Archaeology reveals evidence of feasting on a massive scale. Enormous quantities of animal bones from turkeys, rabbits, deer, and elk, suggesting events far larger than the resident population could account for. People came, brought food, ate together, participated in ceremonies, and went home, leaving broken pottery and offerings in the great kivas, large circular underground ceremonial chambers, some over 60 feet in diameter, sunk into the ground and roofed with massive timbers, containing floor vaults, raised fireboxes, and foot drums. They were designed for large groups to gather. For ceremonies, the architecture facilitated. Standing in a reconstructed Great Kiva today, you feel the circularity, the enclosure, the descent below the surface, the specific acoustics. These spaces were designed to create an experience, a community entering a shared, altered state. In 1150 AD, Chaco essentially stopped. Construction ceased. The road system fell into disrepair. Outlier communities continued, but the canyon lost its centrality. The system fragmented. People moved, many north and east into the Rio Grande Valley, where their descendants, the Pueblo peoples, still live. The why of Chaco's end is as contested as its existence. The most widely accepted explanation involves a severe, prolonged drought in the mid-1100s, making the canyon uninhabitable. But drought alone doesn't fully explain the abandonment. Droughts had struck before, and the system recovered. There are signs of increasing violence, social stress, elite exploitation, and destruction of certain great houses. Whatever the combination, the Chaco system ended, and the canyon returned to silence. Today, Chaco Culture National Historical Park is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, receiving a fraction of the visitors of other parks due to its remote location. But for those who make the trip and sit in the canyon after the visitors leave, Chaco does something to your sense of history that no textbook can achieve. Let us now turn to a mystery in the sky above the American Southwest, or rather, The relationship between sky and ground that ancient peoples encoded into their architecture and art with such consistency and precision that it only becomes fully visible when you step back far enough to see the whole picture. The idea that pre-Columbian North Americans were sophisticated astronomers is not new. The lunar alignments at Newark, the solstice orientations at Chaco, Woodhenge at Cahokia have been documented for decades. But what researchers using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and LiDAR scanning have discovered about the astronomical sophistication embedded in the landscape scale, spatial organization of these cultures goes considerably beyond what most people realize. Consider the Sun Dagger site at Fajada Butte in Chaco Canyon, discovered in 1977 by artist Anna Sofar. It consists of 3 large sandstone slabs leaning against the butte face in a specific arrangement that channels sunlight through gaps onto 2 spiral petroglyphs carved into the cliff face. On the summer solstice, a single dagger of light bisects the center of the larger spiral. On the winter solstice, 2 daggers frame it. On the equinoxes, a smaller dagger bisects the smaller spiral. This is a precision solar calendar, engineered with remarkable accuracy. But the Sun Dagger is relatively small scale. The truly astonishing alignments at Chaco operate at the scale of the entire canyon. Researcher Anna Sofar and her colleagues at the Solstice Project have spent decades documenting how the great houses and roads are oriented to cardinal directions, solstices, equinoxes, and specific astronomical rise and set points in ways that could not be accidental. Chaco Canyon runs roughly southeast to northwest, and the great houses are positioned within that axis to encode multiple astronomical relationships simultaneously. Pueblo Bonito's back wall runs east-west with precision of less than half a degree. The main road systems align to the cardinal directions. Certain great houses appear positioned to mark horizon points where the sun or moon rises on astronomically significant dates. Perhaps the most remarkable claim is that Chaco's entire spatial layout, the positioning of the great houses relative to each other and the canyon's topography, encodes the cardinal directions and astronomical relationships at the scale of the entire system, making the canyon itself an enormous astronomical instrument. This is provocative and not unchallenged. Archaeology tends to be cautious about large-scale pattern claims because the human brain is good at finding patterns even where they don't exist. But the convergence of evidence at Chaco is substantial enough that even skeptical researchers acknowledge astronomical considerations played a significant role in the site's planning. The Chacoans were watching the sky, reading it, and writing what they read into the architecture of their world. This is not unique to Chaco. Across pre-Columbian North American cultures, there are consistent patterns of astronomical awareness encoded in architecture, earthworks, petroglyphs, and settlement organization. The Serpent Mound in Ohio, a sinuous earthwork nearly a quarter-mile long, appears to align its great oval with the summer solstice sunset. The medicine wheels of the northern plains, mysterious stone structures in Wyoming, Montana, and Saskatchewan, show alignments to stellar rise points for calendrical purposes. The great rock art sites of the Colorado Plateau include numerous solar and lunar markers where specific images are illuminated by shafts of light on specific dates. The cumulative picture is of a continental culture deeply, consistently, systematically engaged with the sky, investing enormous labor and ingenuity into encoding astronomical knowledge into the permanent landscape. The practical answer involves agriculture. Knowing when to plant and when to expect frost was life or death information. Encoding that knowledge into the built environment, making it checkable by anyone who knew how to read it, was a form of information storage and community communication. But the astronomical obsession seems to go beyond the practical. The care and precision, the sacred significance, the integration of astronomical symbolism into ritual and art, all suggest these people were answering questions about the nature of the world and the place of humans within it, doing cosmology, building a relationship between the human and cosmic worlds, making it tangible, permanent, and beautiful. Now let us travel to a place most have never heard of in the mountains of Idaho, speaking to a chapter of pre-Columbian history so unusual and poorly understood that even researchers struggle to know what to make of it. In the Snake River Plain of southern Idaho, a cluster of archaeological sites is associated with the Fremont culture, which flourished across much of Utah and adjacent regions from roughly 700 to 1300 AD. The Fremont were a fascinating hybrid civilization, incorporating elements of the corn-growing Puebloan tradition of the Southwest with elements of the hunting-gathering cultures of the Great Basin. They built adobe structures and semi-subterranean pit houses, grew corn, beans, and squash, made distinctive clay figurines with elaborate facial decorations, and created an extraordinary body of rock art. Then, like so many cultures we've discussed, they vanished. Not completely. Their descendants survived in various forms, but the Fremont cultural tradition as a distinct phenomenon ends around 1300 AD, coinciding with a prolonged drought that devastated many cultures in the American West. What the Fremont left behind in their rock art continues to generate intense debate and genuine puzzlement. The Fremont rock art corpus includes thousands of panels of petroglyphs and pictographs spread across an enormous territory. Some is clearly representational: animals, human figures, handprints, geometric patterns familiar from other traditions. But some is stranger. There are figures that look genuinely unusual to modern eyes. Trapezoidal bodies, wide shoulders tapering to narrow waists, large circular or disc-like heads. Features some viewers describe as non-human or at least non-representationally human. Researchers debate whether these represent supernatural beings, spirit helpers in a shamanic tradition, ancestors, deities, or something else entirely. The most famous concentration is in 9 Mile Canyon in Utah, sometimes called the world's longest art gallery. Running over 40 miles through the Book Cliffs of eastern Utah, its walls covered with tens of thousands of petroglyphs and pictographs representing thousands of years of human activity, with Fremont era work among the most extensive and visually striking. The hunting scenes are particularly remarkable, showing coordinated hunts with multiple hunters surrounding herds of bighorn sheep or deer, conveying a specific moment in time with narrative clarity and artistic skill. These are not random marks. They are deliberate artistic choices made by people with a tradition of representation and a specific visual vocabulary. But the panels also include harder-to-interpret images, shield-bearing figures representing a warrior tradition, serpents and spirals and geometric patterns with consistent symbolic significance, and those trapezoidal anthropomorphs with wide shoulders and large heads gazing out from the canyon walls across 1,500 years of subsequent history. We do not know exactly what any of it meant. We know it was meaningful, not random, that the people who made it were communicating something important enough to invest significant effort in making permanent. But the specific content of that communication is largely beyond our reach, and that gap between the evident effort and intentionality and our inability to read it clearly is one of the defining frustrations and fascinations of pre-Columbian archaeology. We are looking at the records of intelligent, creative, purposeful human beings. We can see their skill and care. We cannot hear their voices. Let us spend some time with water, because one of the most underappreciated dimensions of pre-Columbian civilizational achievement in North America is what these cultures did with water. In a continent ranging from hyper-arid deserts to water-rich floodplains, water management was often the difference between survival and collapse, between a small subsistence community and a large complex society. The water management systems some cultures developed were genuinely extraordinary feats of engineering. In the Sonoran Desert of what is now Arizona, the Hohokam people built and maintained the most extensive irrigation system in the pre-Columbian Americas north of Mexico. They flourished from roughly 300 to 1450 AD, and at their peak maintained a network of canals extending for hundreds of miles through the Salt and Gila River valleys. The main canals were enormous, in some cases more than 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep, hand-dug through desert hardpan with wooden tools and the labor of thousands over centuries. The total length of the Hohokam Canal system is estimated at more than 500 miles, though its full extent is still being documented. The canals were precision engineering, dug with careful attention to gradient to maintain water flow without losing it or losing momentum, sized appropriately for the volume they needed to carry, connected to elaborate distribution systems of smaller canals that spread water across the fields of Hohokam farming communities. Someone was in charge of the water, making decisions about allocation, maintenance, and conflict resolution. The organizational structures managing the system were almost certainly sophisticated, even if we cannot reconstruct their specific form. The canal supported an agricultural system growing corn, cotton, beans, squash, tobacco, and other crops in a landscape receiving less than 8 inches of rainfall per year. The Hohokam did not just survive in the desert, they made it bloom. At their peak, they may have numbered in the tens of thousands across their canal-irrigated territory, their settlements ranging from small farmsteads to large platform mound communities serving as administrative and ceremonial centers. The largest Hohokam platform mounds, like the one at Mesa Grande or the enormous site at Pueblo Grande near modern Phoenix, are substantial earthworks speaking to significant labor mobilization and hierarchical social organization. Then there is Snaketown, the type site of the Hohokam tradition, occupied for over 1,000 years, a large complex community including ball courts, the distinctive oval playing fields reflecting Hohokam connections to Mesoamerican cultural traditions far to the south. The Hohokam ball courts are striking examples of how pre-Columbian North American civilizations were embedded in networks of exchange, influence, and connectivity stretching from the southwest deep into Mexico and beyond. The ball game, played with a rubber ball throughout much of Mesoamerica, appears at Hohokam sites in an adapted form, with over 200 ball courts identified, suggesting it and its social, political, and ritual functions were important enough to justify significant communal effort. And then the Hohokam declined around 1350 to 1450 AD. The Great Canal System collapsed due to flooding events in the 14th century, population declines, and the abandonment of platform mound centers. The Hohokam cultural tradition ends, but the people did not vanish. The O'odham peoples of the Sonoran Desert today are almost certainly their descendants, retaining oral traditions and cultural practices connecting them to the Hohokam past. But the Great Canal System, the engineering achievement that had sustained a complex society in one of the most arid landscapes for over 1,000 years, was not rebuilt. When the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, they found the ruins of a canal civilization that had preceded them by several generations, its massive ditches still visible, carrying no water. There is a chapter of pre-Columbian history so little known that when you first encounter it, it feels almost like a secret, involving a landscape, a technology, and a scale of human environmental transformation that rewrites your entire picture of what the Americas were like before European contact. I am talking about the Amazon basin, and I include it in a discussion of North American mysteries because what happened in the Amazon before and during the Mississippian and Chacoan periods was connected to the broader story of American civilizational development in ways researchers are only beginning to articulate. More than that, what happened in the Amazon challenges a fundamental assumption that shaped European thinking for 500 years and still echoes in how we teach pre-Columbian history today: that the Amazon basin, with its poor leach soils and massive biodiversity, was fundamentally unsuited to large-scale human settlement. A pristine wilderness home to small scattered bands of hunter-gatherers and simple horticulturalists, unable to support the dense, complex societies that developed in other river valleys. This assumption was wrong, spectacularly, completely wrong. and the evidence has been accumulating for decades but has only recently begun to penetrate public consciousness. The reality is that the Amazon basin at the time of European contact in the late 1400s and early 1500s was home to millions of people living in complex societies with sophisticated agricultural systems, elaborate infrastructure, large urban settlements, and a level of environmental management so thorough and successful that early European explorers described the Amazon as essentially a garden. Not pristine wilderness, but a landscape managed, modified, and intensively cultivated by human beings. For thousands of years, the evidence takes many forms, none more striking than the discovery and analysis of terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth. Terra preta is a type of soil found across large areas of the Amazon basin that is dramatically different from surrounding soils. Dark, almost black, extraordinarily fertile, capable of supporting intensive agriculture even in nutrient-poor conditions, and entirely the product of human activity. It was created by pre-Columbian Amazonian peoples through deliberate incorporation of charcoal, organic matter, bone, and other materials into the soil over long periods. Essentially an engineered soil designed to overcome one of the fundamental limitations of the Amazonian environment. Patches of terra preta range from small garden plots to areas of several square miles, found at depths of up to 2 meters, associated with pre-Columbian settlement sites, and they continue to be some of the most productive agricultural soils in the Amazon today, centuries after the societies that created them collapsed. The implications are enormous. If people were creating terra preta on a significant scale, they were making a long-term investment in the productivity of their landscape, farming not just for the current generation, but for future generations, building soil capital paying dividends over centuries. This is the behavior of a sophisticated agricultural civilization with an understanding of soil chemistry, long time horizons, and a degree of landscape management rivaling anything in the pre-Columbian world. And terra preta is only part of the story. Recent work using LiDAR technology has revealed enormous earthwork complexes across the Amazon basin, many comparable to those of the Ohio River Valley or the Chaco system. In the Bolivian Amazon, the Llanos de Moxos region contains an extraordinary landscape of raised fields, fish weirs, causeways, canals, and settlement mounds, constituting one of the largest pre-Columbian earthwork systems in the world. The raised fields cover an estimated 20 to 30,000 square miles, elevated above the surrounding savanna to protect crops from seasonal flooding and take advantage of the flood cycle's moisture. Building and maintaining raised fields on this scale required enormous sustained labor investment, implying population and social organization far beyond the standard picture. In the Brazilian Amazon, LiDAR surveys have begun to reveal geometrically planned settlement complexes with circular and rectangular earthworks, connecting roads, and spatial organizations implying sophisticated urban planning. The cumulative effect suggests that the Amazon basin, before the catastrophic demographic collapse caused by European-introduced disease in the 16th and 17th centuries, was home to a complex mosaic of civilizations, some very large, with populations numbering in the millions, whose landscape engineering and agricultural sophistication rivaled anything in the pre-Columbian world. The disease-driven collapse was so severe and rapid that by the time serious European scientific investigation began in the 18th and 19th centuries, the landscape had largely reverted to forest, the populations reduced to tiny fractions, the evidence hidden beneath centuries of forest regeneration. The pristine Amazon the early naturalists described was not a baseline condition. It was a ruin so thorough and overgrown it looked like wilderness. We are only now, with LiDAR, satellite imagery, isotope analysis, and a willingness to take indigenous oral traditions seriously as historical sources, beginning to see what was actually there. It is one of the great untold stories of human history, making you question everything you thought you knew about the line between civilization and wilderness, nature and culture, what the Americas were, and what they might have been. There is a road in New Mexico that most people drive through without slowing down, a stretch of empty high desert between Albuquerque and Gallup that looks like very little. But if you know where to look, the landscape tells a different story, because just north of the modern highway, visible from the right angle at the right time of day, the subtle depressions marking the ancient Chacoan road system still show in the desert surface. Lines in the land that have survived 800 years of wind, rain, and modern development, because the Chacoans built their roads deep and wide and solid enough that the earth remembers them still. Those roads went somewhere, connecting Chaco to a set of outlier communities stretching far out into the San Juan Basin and beyond, communities that participated in the Chacoan system in ways we are still working to understand. Among the most distant and puzzling of these outlier connections is the relationship between Chaco and the communities of the northern San Juan region, what archaeologists call the Mesa Verde area. The high plateau country of southwestern Colorado, home to one of the most visited and visually spectacular archaeological sites in North America, Mesa Verde. The name means green table in Spanish, capturing something real about the landscape. The mesa rises abruptly from the surrounding valleys and canyon country, its top covered with pinyon and juniper forest, its sides cut by deep canyons. The people who live here from roughly 600 to 1300 AD built structures that use that drama to astonishing effect. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are genuinely among the most spectacular architectural achievements in the pre-Columbian Americas. Tucked into enormous natural alcoves erosion has carved into the canyon walls, perched at seemingly impossible heights, accessible only by hand and toe holes cut into the cliff face or by wooden ladders long gone. Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling in North America, contains over 150 rooms and 23 kivas, sitting in an alcove facing almost perfectly to the southeast, catching winter sun while the overhanging cliff shades it from summer sun. Passive solar design moderating the temperature. Whether this solar orientation was intentional is debated, but the physics are real. The cliff dwellings enjoy a notably more hospitable microclimate than the exposed mesa top above, and their builders understood that advantage. The construction itself is remarkable. Builders were working in cramped, difficult spaces, often with walls at their backs and 1,000-foot drops below, using stone masonry techniques rivaling anything in the contemporary medieval European tradition. The masonry is cored sandstone, carefully shaped and fitted in patterns both structurally sound and visually elegant, with mortar joints tight and precise, walls plumb and level, doorways trapezoidal. A distinctive form appearing throughout the ancestral Puebloan architectural tradition, possibly with practical and symbolic significance. The cliff dwellings were built and occupied primarily during the 13th century, the final century of ancestral Puebloan occupation of the Colorado Plateau. There is something poignant in that timing. The cliff dwellings represent not the beginning of Mesa Verde's occupation, but its culmination, or perhaps its last gasp. The people had been living on the mesa top and in pit houses in the canyon bottoms for centuries before moving into the alcoves. The shift to cliff-dwelling architecture in the 1200s coincides with increasing social stress marked by evidence of violence, population aggregation into defensible locations, and the same prolonged drought affecting the Hohokam, Chacoans, and dozens of other cultures across the American West. The cliff dwellings, for all their beauty and technical sophistication, were also fortifications. The hand and toe holes deliberately placed to slow assault, the limited access points defensible by small numbers, the alcoves providing shelter and concealment. Whatever the people of Mesa Verde were afraid of in the late 1200s, they built their homes in locations extremely difficult to reach and attack. And then, around 1280 to 1300 AD, they left. The cliff dwellings were abandoned, not burned or destroyed, just left. Ceramics, corn cobs, turkey bones, human remains in burial alcoves, grinding stones left where they were used, kiva roofing timbers rotting and collapsing onto intact floors. The people who built Cliff Palace and Spruce Tree House and Balcony House simply walked away, south and east most archaeologists believe, down to the Rio Grande Valley and the Southern Plateau country, where their descendants, the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, still live and still practice the kiva ceremonies, pottery traditions, and architectural forms connecting them across 7 centuries to the builders of Mesa Verde. The Pueblo peoples have never lost the memory of Mesa Verde. It is their ancestors' country. Their oral traditions speak of the time before they came to their current homes, of migrations and places of great significance. The connection is not forgotten, just not always visible to outsiders who know the history only from the outside. In the summer of 2010, archaeologists working in central Illinois made a discovery so unexpected and significant it temporarily reshuffled research priorities. At Emerald Acropolis near modern Cahokia's regional sphere, they found evidence of what appears to be a massive shrine complex oriented to the winter solstice sunrise, containing enormous quantities of mass features, large deposits of nuts, seeds, and other plant remains representing feasting events of extraordinary scale. The Emerald Acropolis findings, still being processed and published, suggest the ceremonial landscape of the greater Cahokia region extended far beyond the mounds and plazas of the main city into a network of outlying sacred sites integrated into the political and religious life of the polity in ways previous research had not fully captured. This is the nature of archaeology in the American Midwest and Southeast. Every few years, a new site, a new technique, or a new application of an existing technique reveals that the picture we thought we had was incomplete in important ways. The civilizations flourishing between roughly 800 and 1400 AD were more complex, interconnected, and architecturally ambitious than standard history has been willing to acknowledge. Part of this is simple. The materials these cultures built with were organic: wood, earth, and thatch, not stone. The earthworks survive, but the wooden structures on top of mounds have long rotted. The thatch and hide coverings of houses have vanished, leaving the bones of the system, not its flesh. When archaeologists use ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and soil coring to investigate Mississippian sites, they consistently find evidence of more activity, more construction, more spatial complexity than surface appearance suggests. The sites are bigger on the inside than they look from the outside, and there are sites still being discovered. The American Midwest has never been systematically surveyed at the resolution modern remote sensing technology makes possible. Every LiDAR survey reveals new sites, and every new site raises new questions. The picture of pre-Columbian North America is not a completed puzzle needing a few pieces filled in. It is a puzzle where we have not yet found most of the pieces, and every new piece reveals the picture is larger and more complex than we imagined. Consider the story of the Spiro Mounds in eastern Oklahoma. Spiro was a major Mississippian ceremonial center flourishing from roughly 900 to 1450 AD on the Arkansas River, connected to Cahokia and the broader Mississippian trade network through the circulation of elaborate ceremonial objects defining the southeastern ceremonial complex. The suite of shared iconographic and artifact traditions linking Mississippian communities from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, sometimes called the Southern Cult. It was a shared symbolic system expressed in the imagery carved on shell gorgets and engraved copper plates and painted pottery, connecting communities across an enormous territory. The imagery is striking and distinctive. Falcon warriors, serpents, crosses and circles, chunky players, elaborate costumed figures with wings and animal attributes, appearing repeatedly across the entire Mississippian world, suggesting a degree of shared iconographic tradition and possibly shared ideology that implies connections beyond trade and material goods. Ideas were traveling, beliefs, stories at Spiro. The particular concentration of southeastern ceremonial complex material is extraordinary. The site contains a suite of mounds, including the Craig Mound, serving as an elite mortuary complex for several centuries. When looters broke into the Craig Mound in the early 1930s, they found a hollow chamber inside filled with an extraordinary collection of objects. Engraved shell cups, copper plates covered in southeastern ceremonial complex imagery, beaded textiles, stone pipes carved in human and animal forms of remarkable artistry, cedar litter poles wrapped in copper, human skulls, and long bones arranged in specific patterns. The looting of Spiro was one of the great archaeological disasters of 20th century America. Before the site was protected and professionally excavated, enormous quantities of irreplaceable material were removed, sold, dispersed into private collections, and in some cases destroyed. But even what was recovered professionally tells a remarkable story. The Craig Mound was a repository of sacred objects on a scale, implying a community with both the resources and the belief system to invest enormously in the material expression of its relationship to the sacred. The objects that survived the looting are among the finest examples of pre-Columbian art and craftsmanship in North America. The engraved shell cups showing scenes from Mississippian mythology and ceremony. A great serpent, a game of chunky played by costumed figures. Images of the world axis connecting upper and lower realms. Figures who are simultaneously human and bird and other things that do not fit our familiar categories. The Mississippian cosmos, as we can reconstruct it from iconographic evidence, was a layered world. Sky above, earth in the middle, underworld below, the sun moving through all three realms in its daily and annual cycles. Great supernatural beings inhabiting each layer, with human ritual and ceremony serving as the interface between the human and supernatural realms. The elite class of Mississippian society served as mediators of this interface. Their authority, both political and cosmological, connected to the sky and the sun in ways ordinary people were not, and the elaborate symbolism of the southeastern ceremonial complex expressed and reinforced those connections through every object and ceremony it touched. This was a complete worldview, as fully articulated and internally coherent as any theological tradition in the Old World at the same time, and it was gone essentially by the time European contact began. The demographic catastrophe of introduced disease in the 16th century struck the Mississippian world with particular violence. The societies were dense, interconnected communities, ideal environments for epidemic spread. When the diseases came in waves, the effects were catastrophic. Some communities lost the majority of their population within a generation. The political structures organizing Mississippian society collapsed under the demographic pressure. By the time European colonizers began seriously engaging with the interior in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Mississippian tradition as a functioning political and ceremonial system was already a generation or more in the past. What remained were smaller, reorganized communities, still carrying pieces of the old tradition, but unable to fully reconstruct the complex web of institutions and practices that had sustained it. The mounds remained, the roads and plazas overgrown, and Europeans, encountering these architectural remnants without any surviving memory of the civilization that had built them, invented stories of lost races and vanished peoples to explain what they were seeing. The true story, the story of a genuinely complex and sophisticated indigenous American civilization, was hiding in plain sight in the oral traditions of the very people Europeans were dispossessing. It just required the willingness to listen. There is a question hanging over all this history like a cloud. One researcher's approach carefully and popular literature often handles irresponsibly, but deserves to be addressed directly because it is genuinely important. How did all these cultures, Hopewell, Mississippians, Chacoans, Hohokam, Poverty Point people, and the rest, communicate their most sophisticated ideas across the enormous distances separating them? How did the same astronomical alignments appear in Ohio and New Mexico? How did the same iconographic motifs surface from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes? How did the idea of the platform mound and the Great Plaza spread across an entire continent. How did the Hopewell trade network function with the precision and regularity the archaeological evidence implies? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. We can document the connections, trace the material evidence of exchange, identify the shared architectural and artistic traditions, but the mechanisms of transmission, the specific social structures and communication systems maintaining coherence across a continental trading network or shared religious tradition, are still largely opaque. What we can say is that the evidence for long-distance communication and cultural transmission in pre-Columbian North America is overwhelming and consistent. It is not a puzzle that connections existed. The puzzle is how they were maintained. Some researchers point to the role of specialized traders, people traveling regularly between communities, embedded in kin networks and ceremonial institutions, with trade partners treated as adoptive relatives with specific reciprocal obligations. Remarkably efficient and durable, maintaining connections across enormous distances through generations. Others point to itinerant religious specialists, comparable to wandering monks and missionaries, carrying sacred knowledge and ceremonial practices from community to community across regional networks, explaining the spread of specific ritual objects, forms, and iconographic traditions. And there is the possibility that some large ceremonial centers, Chaco, Cahokia, Newark, served as pilgrimage destinations, drawing people from wide regions for periodic gatherings where ideas and practices were shared, marriages arranged, goods exchanged, alliances formed, and cosmological knowledge transmitted from specialists to regional audiences. The pilgrimage model is attractive because it explains the archaeological evidence of large-scale feasting and gathering without requiring a permanent large population, providing a plausible mechanism for the rapid spread of cultural innovations across vast territories. Whatever the specific mechanisms, the reality of pan-cultural connectivity in pre-Columbian North America is not in serious doubt. The Americas before European contact were not a collection of isolated primitive villages. They were a world, an enormously complex, interconnected, culturally rich world with its own geopolitics, intellectual traditions, and history of rise and fall and transformation. They were, in short, a civilization, or rather a collection of civilizations that used a different vocabulary than the civilizations of the Old World, but were no less sophisticated, no less creative, and no less human. Let us sit for a moment with one of the deepest mysteries of this entire story, not primarily about earthworks, trade networks, or astronomical alignments, but about something more fundamental. What happened to these civilizations? The gap between the world European explorers first described when they reached the interior and the world the archaeological record shows existed here. The gap is enormous. When Hernando de Soto led his expedition through the American Southeast between 1539 and 1542, he encountered large organized chiefdoms with substantial populations, fortified towns, and political complexity clearly deriving from the Mississippian tradition. He described towns of thousands, kings carried on litters commanding wide regions, ceremonial plazas and earthen mounds still in use. A world recognizably descended from the Mississippian fluorescence, diminished but not yet destroyed. When Europeans made sustained contact with the interior a century and a half later, they found something very different. The large chiefdoms de Soto described were gone. The population densities were gone. The political structures commanding tribute over wide regions were gone. What remained were smaller, reorganized communities, often amalgamations of remnant populations of multiple previously distinct groups, struggling to maintain cultural coherence in the face of ongoing disease, displacement, and colonial pressure. What happened in the century and a half between de Soto and later explorers? Disease, almost certainly disease above all else. The epidemic cycle following European contact in the Americas was one of the most catastrophic demographic events in human history. populations never exposed to smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and dozens of other European diseases had no acquired immunity and were devastated. Estimates of pre-contact population sizes in the Americas are still intensely debated, but the evidence increasingly supports figures once considered wildly optimistic. The Western Hemisphere in 1491 may have been home to 60 to 80 million people. Within a century and a half of sustained European contact, that population had fallen by 50 to 90% in many regions. The death toll was so enormous it transformed the landscape. The reforestation of cleared agricultural land across vast areas following population collapse contributed to a measurable drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide in the early 17th century, an event climatologists have identified in ice cores and tree ring records, some researchers calling it the Orbis spike, the point at which European colonization became visible in the global climate record. The forests 19th century naturalists described as primeval wilderness were in many cases regrowth of agricultural landscapes abandoned within living memory. The animals that proliferated, deer, bison, beaver, giving the impression of an untouched continent, were filling an ecological vacuum created by demographic collapse. The wilderness European settlers encountered when they pushed into the interior was not a baseline condition. It was a catastrophe that erased or nearly erased not just people, but the memory of what those people had achieved. And this is why the pre-Columbian history of North America reads to so many people as a mystery. Not because evidence of what happened is thin or ambiguous. The mounds, earthworks, ceramics, road systems, astronomical alignments are actually quite clear, but because the living memory of what happened, the oral traditions, genealogies, and specific stories that would have put flesh on those archaeological bones was disrupted, damaged, and in some cases destroyed by the catastrophe of colonization and disease. We are trying to read a book from which many pages have been torn. What remains is extraordinary, but we feel the absence of what was lost more acutely the more carefully we look at what we have. There is a site in Louisiana I want to return to, not Poverty Point this time, but another even older and less well-known, sitting in a cypress swamp in the northeastern part of the state that has fundamentally changed the story of when and how complex society developed in the Americas. Watson Break. The Watson Break site consists of 11 earthen mounds connected by a low earthen ridge forming an oval enclosure roughly 900 feet in its longest dimension. The mounds range from 3 to 25 feet in height, the overall plan deliberate and geometrically coherent. Clearly the product of planned construction rather than casual accumulation, and it dates to approximately 3400 BC. 5,400 years ago. This is not a typo. Watson Break was built approximately 5,400 years ago, making it the oldest known complex earthwork in the Americas and one of the oldest in the world. It predates Poverty Point by 1,700 years, Stonehenge in its final form by roughly 500 years, and the Egyptian pyramids. When Watson Break was being built, the inhabitants of what would one day become Mesopotamia were just beginning to develop writing. The people who built Watson Break were hunter-gatherers, not farmers, not settled agriculturalists, not members of a complex chiefdom with a surplus-extracting elite class. They were hunters and gatherers, and they built an 11-mound complex in a planned geometrical form using baskets of earth carried by hand over several centuries. Everything archaeologists thought they knew about the relationship between agriculture and monumental architecture, about the preconditions for complex construction projects, about the level of social organization required to mobilize large-scale labor, was turned on its head by Watson Break. The site was discovered in the 1980s, described in publications, and largely overlooked for over a decade. It was too anomalous. It didn't fit the models. When the site was more thoroughly investigated in the 1990s and the dates confirmed by multiple independent laboratories, the field had to grapple with the implications. Hunter-gatherers in the American Southeast were building planned earthwork complexes 5,000 years ago. The complexity of their society, The organizational capacity required to plan and execute a multi-mound complex over multiple generations was not supposed to be possible without agriculture. But there it was, and Watson Brake was not alone. As awareness spread and researchers looked more carefully at the earthwork record of the lower Mississippi Valley, other early sites began to surface. Cane Mounds, Monte Sano, Frenchman's Bend, a cluster in the same region, all predating Poverty Point, all exhibiting similar characteristics. Hunter-gatherer communities building planned earthwork complexes serving as gathering places, ceremonial centers, probably exchange nodes in a regional network. The picture emerged of a long tradition of monumental construction in the lower Mississippi Valley, stretching from the 5th or 6th millennium BC through Poverty Point and on into the Mississippian period. A tradition of using the landscape as a medium for social and cosmological expression, remarkably continuous across thousands of years. What motivated these early builders? What were they saying with their mounds, ridges, geometric forms, careful orientations? We cannot ask them, cannot read their minds, but we can observe they found it worth doing, worth the enormous investment of communal labor, the sustained organizational effort over multiple generations, worth building something that would endure long after any individual memory of its construction had faded. They were doing what humans do, making their mark on the world, saying, "We were here, and this place mattered to us, and we want that to endure." And it has. 5,000 years later, their mounds still stand in the cypress swamps of Louisiana, barely known to people living within miles, containing in their profiles and plans and astronomical alignments a record of human ambition and community that, if you allow yourself to feel it fully, is genuinely moving. There is something that happens when you spend time with this history, really spend time with it, that is hard to describe precisely, but is one of the things making this material so compelling for late-night listening. A kind of double vision develops. You start to see the landscape around you differently. You become aware of the depth of time underlying every familiar place. You start to notice features of the terrain that might be archaeological. Slight rises in a field that could be a buried mound. Faint lines across a hillside that might be the trace of an ancient road. Shallow depressions at the edge of a parking lot marking the boundary of a long-abandoned village. The land remembers things we have forgotten, holding in its contours, soil chemistry, and buried artifact assemblages a record of human presence going back much further than our cultural memory reaches. That record, when you know how to read it, or even just are aware it is there to be read, changes how you inhabit the present. The people who built the earthworks of the Ohio River Valley, who raised the platform mounds of the Mississippi, who engineered the roads of Chaco, who dug the canals of the Hohokam, who constructed the ridges of Poverty Point, who placed the first basket of earth on what would become Watson Brake more than 5,000 years ago. These people are not gone. Their descendants are living, practicing cultures with continuous histories and living relationships to these ancient places. The Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw are descended from the Mississippians. The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona are descended from the Chacoans and Mesa Verdeans. The O'odham of the Sonoran Desert are descended from the Hohokam. The tribes of the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest carry Hopewell heritage. The connection is not severed. It is strained and complicated, and in some cases nearly invisible because the catastrophe of colonization worked hard to sever it. But it persists. When these communities speak about these ancient places, when they assert their relationship to the mounds, roads, earthworks, and cliff dwellings, they are not making primarily a legal or political argument. Though it is that too, they are making a historical statement. They are saying, "We remember. We have not forgotten. These are our ancestors' places, and our ancestors were extraordinary, and their extraordinariness is part of who we are." That statement deserves to be taken seriously, not just as an expression of cultural pride or legal rights, though both matter enormously, but as a historical claim, because the evidence supports it. The pre-Columbian civilizations of North America were extraordinary. Their engineering, astronomy, art, trade networks, political systems, and agricultural innovations were genuine achievements comparable to any civilization in the ancient world. The story of the Americas before Columbus is not a story of absence and emptiness waiting for civilization from elsewhere. It is a story of human ingenuity, ambition, and community flourishing on this continent for tens of thousands of years. And that story belongs to the descendants of the people who lived it. We should talk about what is buried under the ground of the modern United States that we have still not found, because this is a dimension of the pre-Columbian story most people never think about but is enormously important. The existing record of pre-Columbian sites in North America is almost certainly a tiny fraction of the total record that actually exists. We know this for several reasons. First, systematic archaeological survey of the United States is far from complete. Large regions have never been professionally surveyed at the resolution required to identify small or subtly preserved sites. When LiDAR surveys have been applied to regions thought to be well studied archaeologically, they consistently reveal new sites, sometimes dramatically increasing known site counts. The application of LiDAR to the American Midwest and Southeast, where earthwork sites are common and often subtle, has been particularly revealing. Second, a significant portion of the pre-Columbian landscape has been directly destroyed by development. The expansion of American cities, suburbs, and agricultural land over the past 2 centuries has obliterated an enormous number of sites. Cahokia itself is surrounded, and in some areas directly impacted by the development of Collinsville and East St. Louis. Dozens of mounds documented by early 19th century observers no longer exist. Third, and perhaps most important for understanding the scale of what is still unknown, the portion of the pre-Columbian settlement landscape underwater is almost entirely unstudied. During the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 300 feet lower than today. Vast areas of what is now continental shelf were dry land. The coastlines of North America were very different, and the people living in the Americas during the Ice Age and immediately following, some of the first human inhabitants, were living in landscapes now under the ocean. Their campsites, middens, earthworks, if they build any, seasonal camps and year-round villages are all on the seafloor. Some has been found, occasional sites on the continental shelf identified by underwater archaeology, with tantalizing hints of what might be down there. Shell middens on the shelf off the coasts of Florida and the Gulf states, stone points and tools brought up by fishing nets from the seafloor, traces of paleosols, ancient ground surfaces at various depths that would have been habitable during low sea level periods. But underwater archaeology is expensive and difficult, and systematic investigation of the flooded pre-Columbian landscape of North America is still in its very early stages. What we know about the earliest human occupation of the continent, the time of the Pleistocene megafauna, the Clovis culture, and the complex questions about who was here first, when, and how, is based almost entirely on sites that happen to have been on high ground during low sea level periods and remained accessible as the sea rose. An unknown, but potentially significant portion of the early American story is still sitting on the continental shelf waiting to be found. Let us spend some time with a mystery that exists not in the physical landscape, but in the record of art and symbol pre-Columbian North Americans left behind. A record containing some of the most beautiful and puzzling objects ever produced on this continent. Objects whose full meaning we may never recover, but that speak across centuries and millennia of minds and imaginations as rich and restless as any that have looked up at the stars. The Cooper bison skull, painted with lightning bolts in bright red pigment and buried in a cache of other bison skulls on the Oklahoma plains approximately 10,000 years ago. Nobody knows what it meant, what the lightning bolts signified, whether it was a ritual object, personal possession, community property, marker, or gift to the earth. We know only that someone 10,000 years ago on the Great Plains thought it important enough to paint a bison skull with red lightning and bury it carefully. The woodland burial mounds of the Ohio River Valley contain objects of extraordinary artistic achievement. Copper headdresses in the form of deer antlers, ear spools of worked meteoric iron, effigy pipes carved in the forms of animals, bears, beavers, frogs, birds, with anatomical accuracy and aesthetic sensibility reflecting deep, sustained observation of the natural world. These objects were made by specific individuals with extraordinary skill and probably significant social roles in communities that valued and supported the production of beautiful and meaningful objects to a degree implying a sophisticated appreciation for art and craft. The pipes are particularly compelling. Hopewell effigy pipes made from a specific type of highly polished pipestone quarried in Ohio, showing animals in poses that capture something essential about their subjects. There is a beaver pipe that manages in a few inches of carved stone to convey the specific weight and heft of a beaver, the way it sits, the attitude of its head. The carver who made that pipe knew beavers. They had watched them for hours, probably years, with the patient, attentive eye of someone for whom observing animals was a central intellectual activity. The Mississippian ceramic tradition is another window into the richness of visual culture. Mississippian potters produced an astonishing variety of vessel forms, including effigy vessels depicting human faces in a range of expressions and types, animals, vegetables, and forms appearing to represent specific individuals with specific identifiable features. Portrait vessels of real people who lived in Mississippian society 1,000 years ago. Looking at a Mississippian portrait vessel is an uncanny experience. The faces are individual, specific, human. They have been described by art historians as among the most sophisticated portrait ceramics produced anywhere in the ancient world. They represent people who were alive, who had names and histories and relationships, whose faces someone cared enough to preserve in this permanent form. Those people are gone now as individuals. We cannot know their names or stories, but their faces are still here, looking out from museum cases and archaeological reports, asking to be seen. There are also the rock art traditions of the American Southwest, the Colorado Plateau, the Great Plains, and dozens of other regions, collectively constituting one of the largest and most varied bodies of pre-Columbian visual art anywhere in the world. From the petroglyphs of the Coso Range in California, where tens of thousands of bighorn sheep and other images were pecked into volcanic rock over thousands of years, to the painted Kiva murals of Chihuahua Pueblo in New Mexico, preserving a fragment of a lost tradition of large-scale religious painting in brilliant mineral pigments. The rock art traditions speak of visual cultures of extraordinary sophistication and diversity. But perhaps the most haunting pre-Columbian art objects in North America are the ones that do not look like art at all. The geometric earthworks of the Hopewell culture, viewed from above, are forms of visual expression at a scale that dwarfs any individual carved or painted object. The Newark octagon, with its 8 precisely aligned walls enclosing more than 50 acres, is a work of art as much as it is a work of engineering, expressing a relationship between earth and sky, human community and cosmic order, measurable and sacred, that no smaller object could have conveyed. To fully see it in the way the Hopewell intended, you would need to be in the air looking down. And perhaps they were, in some sense, imagining exactly that, building for the gaze of whatever they understood to occupy the sky. We are coming now toward the end of this journey, or at least toward the end of this particular night's portion. There are a few things I want to say before the silence takes over, and you drift into whatever kind of sleep follows a long immersion in deep time. The first is about scale. When we talk about the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America, we are talking about a span of time genuinely difficult to comprehend intuitively. Watson Break was built 5,400 years ago, more than twice as long ago as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Hopewell culture flourished 2,000 years ago at roughly the same time as the height of Roman power in the Mediterranean. The Chacoans built their roads 800 to 1,000 years ago, roughly contemporaneous with the building of the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe. Cahokia peaked 9 centuries ago at a time when Genghis Khan was creating the Mongol Empire on the other side of the world. Mesa Verde was abandoned 700 years ago, just before the Black Death swept across Europe. The history of these civilizations is not ancient in the way the Egyptians or Sumerians are ancient. It is in many ways recent, the history of the last few thousand years unfolding on this continent, while history, as we usually mean it was being written elsewhere. It happened here on this ground under this sky. The second thing is that the physical connection between these ancient civilizations and the landscape of the modern United States is direct and immediate. The mounds at Cahokia are still there. The earthworks at Newark are still there, though golf courses have been built on parts of the octagon. The great houses at Chaco are still there, and so are the roads, buried under sand and accessible only to radar and careful ground survey. But there, the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde are still there. The ruins of the Hohokam canals are still there. And in some cases, the modern canal system of the Phoenix metropolitan area follows the same routes as the Hohokam originals, because the Hohokam engineering was so good that the optimal routes through the Salt River Valley have not changed in 1,000 years. This history is not distant. It is not separate from the landscape of contemporary American life. It is in the ground beneath every strip mall built on a river floodplain, in the slight rises in the fields of Ohio and Illinois that mark buried mound complexes, in the dry riverbeds of the Southwest where Hohokam canals once ran. The land is full of it. The third thing is that there is a reason this history is not better known, better taught, more present in the public consciousness of the United States. Not because the evidence is obscure or the civilizations insignificant, but because acknowledging the depth and sophistication of pre-Columbian North American civilization raises uncomfortable questions about the narrative of European colonization and the moral framework within which that narrative has usually been told. If the people living here when Europeans arrived were not scattered primitives wandering through an untouched wilderness, but inheritors and descendants of civilizations that had been building cities, roads, astronomical observatories, and continent-spanning trade networks for thousands of years before Columbus, then the moral calculus of colonization looks different. Not because it changes the fundamental ethical nature of the violence, dispossession, and demographic catastrophe, but because it changes the scale of what was lost. And acknowledging the full scale of what was lost is painful. It is easier to believe the myth of the empty continent, to believe what Europeans found here was wilderness, not history. But the wilderness was not empty, and the history was not nothing. It was something remarkable and complex and human and lost. And the least we can do is remember it honestly. The night is getting long now, and the questions are getting quieter, settling into that particular quality of late-night wondering that is not quite sleep but halfway there. Let me tell you about one more thing before I let the silence have you. There is a site in southern Illinois called Kincaid that most people have never heard of, a Mississippian platform mound complex that was a significant regional center from roughly 900 to 1400 AD, consisting of a large central plaza surrounded by platform mounds, the largest rising over 30 feet. It was excavated by archaeologists from the University of Chicago in the 1930s, a landmark project. In the deposits, they found something that has always struck me as one of the more poignant artifacts in the entire record of pre-Columbian North America. Toys, small clay figures of animals and humans, clearly made not with the care and skill of a craft specialist producing ceremonial objects, but with the enthusiastic and slightly clumsy effort of children making things for fun. Little clay animals with lopsided legs, small human figures with oversized heads. The kinds of things children everywhere and in every era have made when given clay and left to their own devices. There were children at Kincaid, children who ran through the plaza between the great mounds, children who played in the shadow of the platform where the elite performed their ceremonies, Children who grew up in the world of Mississippian civilization with the same mix of wonder, boredom, mischief, and learning that children everywhere grow up with. They did not know they were going to be forgotten. They did not know the civilization they were growing up in would collapse within a few generations. They did not know a disease they had never heard of, carried by people from a continent they had never imagined, would arrive in their grandchildren's time and change everything. They were just children playing in the dirt, making little clay animals, living in the world as they found it. Something about that, the specificity and smallness of those lopsided clay creatures, makes the vastness of the history we have been moving through tonight feel suddenly intimate and near. That is what all this history is in the end. Not just earthworks, road systems, and astronomical alignments, though it is all of those things. It is people, specific human beings, born, living, dying, building things, making things, teaching their children, feeding their families, telling stories by firelight, looking up at the stars and wondering what it all means. They wondered the same things we wonder. They were asking the same questions we are still asking. The civilizations they built, extraordinary as they were just the setting for that most fundamental of human activities, trying to make sense of being here. The mounds are patient. They have been waiting in the dark for 1,000 years, or 2,000 years, or 5,000 years, and they are not in any hurry. They will wait while development encroaches, while plows pass, while tourists come and go. They will wait while we argue about their significance, debate their origins, measure their alignments, and publish papers about their construction. They will wait because they are made of the same earth everything else is made of, and that earth is going nowhere. But I hope, having spent this night with them, you are a little less likely to pass them by without knowing what they are. I hope the next time you drive through the Midwest on a highway cutting across a river floodplain, you will notice the slight rises in the fields and wonder whether any of them are something more than natural topography. I hope when you visit the Southwest and stand in the ruins of a great house at Chaco, or look up at the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, you will feel the full weight of what those places represent, who built them, how long ago, and how completely our official history has failed to honor what they achieved. I hope when you hear the words pre-Columbian or prehistoric or ancient America, the images that come to mind are not the vague stereotype of primitive people scratching in the dirt, but the sophisticated, ambitious, cosmologically engaged, artistically brilliant, organizationally sophisticated civilizations that actually existed here on this ground under these stars. They deserve to be known. They deserve to be remembered. And the fact that so much of their story remains mysterious, that so many deepest questions about their beliefs, organization, and collapse remain open, is not a reason to stop asking. It is a reason to keep going. The mystery is the invitation. The gaps in our knowledge are the spaces where curiosity lives. The work of filling those gaps slowly, carefully, with evidence and with respect for the living descendants of these ancient peoples, is some of the most important and fascinating work being done in American scholarship today. So when you wake up tomorrow and the sun comes through your window and the world looks ordinary and familiar and accounted for, remember that it is not. The ordinary landscape of the United States is sitting on top of an extraordinary history, one stretching back further than our official memory reaches, one that built things and thought things and made beauty we are still only beginning to appreciate. The megastructures are out there, waiting in the dark of the earth, patient as the mounds themselves, asking only to be remembered. If you find yourself tonight on the edge of sleep, in that long, slow dissolution between waking and dreaming, maybe you will feel them. The weight of earth moved basket by basket with human intentions, the alignment of stars somebody watched for decades to encode into stone and earth. The community gathered in a great kiva breathing together in firelight beneath a roof of massive timbers carried 30 miles on human shoulders. The child at Kincaid making a lopsided clay animal in the shadow of the mound. They were all here, and in some sense that matters more than we have words for. They are still here in the ground, in the sky, in the stories we are willing to tell about them, in the willingness finally to look at the landscape we live in and see it whole. Good night. The mounds are patient, and so are the stars. Let us go deeper into what archaeologists call the Eastern Woodlands. That vast forested region between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi River, home to some of the most culturally diverse and astonishing pre-Columbian civilizations of North America. Because when most people think about pre-Columbian North America, even those who know about Cahokia and the Hopewell, they tend to think of a relatively sparse and disconnected set of cultures scattered across an enormous landscape. The reality was far more densely populated, far more interconnected, and far more culturally sophisticated than the standard picture allows. Consider the Connecticut River Valley in what is now southern New England. 1,000 years ago, this valley was home to a substantial population of Algonquian-speaking peoples farming corn, beans, and squash in the rich bottomlands, fishing the river runs of aloes, shad, and salmon that were then one of the great natural bounties of the Northeast, and participating in trade networks connecting them to communities as far away as the Great Lakes and Chesapeake Bay. Their long houses and villages are gone, replaced by towns and farms of the colonial period and suburban landscapes of the modern era. But the soil still holds traces of their occupation in middens, post molds, buried hearths, and occasional caches of stone tools turning up when a homeowner digs a garden or a contractor excavates a foundation. These people were not mysterious. They were not vanished in any supernatural sense. Their descendants, the Pequot, Mohegan, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Pecumtuck, are still here, many living in New England today, maintaining cultural identities against enormous pressure over generations. But the pre-contact landscape of New England, existing before the epidemics devastating its indigenous population in the early 17th century, is poorly understood by most because it was so thoroughly replaced by the colonial landscape that followed. When Puritan settlers arrived in Massachusetts in the 1620s and 1630s, they encountered a landscape the devastating epidemic of 1616 to 1619 had emptied of much of its population. Cleared fields, ruins of villages, roads through the forest leading to places no one seemed to inhabit anymore. They interpreted what they found as providence, a divinely cleared path for their settlement. But what they were actually walking through was the aftermath of a catastrophe. The cleared fields were gifts of the abandoned gardens of people who had died. The roads were paths maintained by communities that no longer existed. The apparent emptiness of coastal New England was not a natural condition, but the most recent chapter of a disaster still ongoing. Before that disaster, New England had been populated at a density its colonial observers, looking at the post-epidemic landscape, consistently underestimated. The archaeology of pre-contact New England reveals a landscape of corn-growing communities along river valleys, seasonal camps on the coast and in the uplands, sacred landscape features including ceremonial stone walls and rock shelters that indigenous peoples maintained and used for centuries or millennia before European arrival. The stone walls crisscrossing the New England landscape, most assumed to be colonial farmers' work, are in many cases far more complex. Archaeologists have identified stone walls appearing to predate colonial settlement, not associated with any colonial field clearing, following alignments suggesting astronomical or territorial significance rather than agricultural practicality. This is contested territory, and claims need careful evaluation. But the possibility that some stone features reflect a deeper indigenous history than usually acknowledged is being explored with increasing rigor. Further south in the Chesapeake Bay region, the picture of pre-contact civilization is clearer, in part because English settlement began early enough for written accounts of indigenous societies that survived, diminished but not destroyed, when John Smith and the founders of Virginia arrived in 1607. Smith's map of the Chesapeake, produced during his 1608 explorations, is a remarkable document showing dozens of towns and villages along the Bay rivers. many with names and approximate population figures. The Powhatan Confederacy, the political alliance of Algonquian-speaking tribes controlling much of the Chesapeake at English arrival, was a sophisticated political entity governed by paramount chief Wahunsinkaw, whom the English called Powhatan, commanding tribute from over 30 distinct tribal groups and maintaining authority through kinship networks, military power, and ceremonial prestige. The Powhatan chiefdom was not ancient. It appears assembled in the generation or two before English contact as a response to growing political pressures, possibly including epidemic disease moving inland from earlier European contacts along the coast. But it drew on a deeper tradition of political complexity in the Chesapeake region with roots in woodland period cultures of preceding centuries and millennia. Smith described Powhatan towns with populations in the hundreds, surrounded by cleared fields of corn, beans, and squash stretching for miles along river bottom lands. An organized system of tribute collection, ceremonial performances, diplomatic protocols, clearly the product of a sophisticated political culture with its own rules, norms, and expectations. He may not have fully understood what he was seeing, and his account is filtered through his cultural assumptions and political purposes, but the basic picture of a complex, organized, politically sophisticated indigenous society is confirmed by the archaeological record. The Chesapeake before European contact was home to tens of thousands of people living in organized communities. Farming, fishing, trading, participating in political structures evolved over centuries to manage relationships across a complex landscape. And within a generation of sustained English contact, most of it was gone. Now let us turn to a part of the pre-Columbian story that gets almost no attention in popular accounts, but is genuinely fascinating and illuminates the deep history of the continent in unexpected ways. Corn. Not corn as a crop, though it was extraordinary, but corn as a technology. The development of maize agriculture in the Americas is one of the greatest single technological achievements in human history, and understanding it changes your picture of what American civilizations were capable of. Modern corn, the plant feeding much of the world today, was developed from a wild grass called teosinte growing in the highlands of Mexico. Teosinte and corn look almost nothing alike to a modern eye. Teosinte is a weedy-looking grass with tiny seed heads containing a few hard seeds, while modern corn is a massive plant with large ears containing hundreds of starchy kernels. The genetic distance between teosinte and corn is enormous, representing thousands of years of deliberate human selection. Choosing plants with slightly larger seeds, more kernel rows, thinner husks, planting those seeds, choosing again from resulting plants generation after generation for thousands of years, until the insignificant wild grass became one of the world's most productive food plants. This is not simple. It is not accidental. The development of maize from teosinte was a deliberate, sustained, multi-generational breeding program carried out without modern genetics or plant science, requiring careful observation, deliberate selection, careful seed stock management, and a sustained cultural commitment across hundreds of generations. It was in every meaningful sense a feat of applied science, and the people who did it were the indigenous peoples of Mexico, beginning roughly 9,000 years ago, and continuing for millennia until they created the variety of corn adopted and modified by every agricultural civilization of the Americas. The spread of corn northward into what is now the United States was a slow process, constrained partly by the need to develop new varieties adapted to different climates and partly by the social and economic processes through which new technologies spread between cultures. Corn arrived in the American Southwest around 2,000 years ago, in the Midwest around 1,500 years ago, and in the Northeast around 1,000 years ago. But when it arrived, it transformed everything it touched. The Mississippian fluorescence, Cahokia and its regional contemporaries, was built on corn. The platform mounds, great plazas, and elaborate ceremonial systems of the Mississippian world were all sustained by the caloric surplus intensive corn agriculture generated. Without corn, Cahokia was impossible. The adoption and intensification of corn agriculture in the American Bottom, the spectacularly fertile floodplain east of St. Louis, in the centuries before Cahokia's rise, created the agricultural base supporting the city's population and the political economy that made its construction possible. The deeper point is that the agricultural systems of the pre-Columbian Americas were not primitive or rudimentary. They were sophisticated, productive, and in many cases remarkably sustainable. The Three Sisters system, companion planting of corn, beans, and squash practiced across much of North America, is an example of ecological sophistication modern agronomists still admire. Beans fix nitrogen, corn depletes, squash shades ground to retain moisture and suppress weeds. The system more productive per acre than monoculture and more sustainable over time. Developed through patient observation and experimentation over thousands of years of agricultural practice, representing a deep understanding of ecological relationships. The Hohokam Canal system was not just engineering, but an expression of sophisticated water management knowledge. Understanding hydraulics and agronomy of irrigated desert agriculture, allowing a complex society to sustain itself in one of the most challenging agricultural environments for over 1,000 years. The raised fields of the Bolivian Amazon, the Terra Preta of Brazil, the terraced hillsides of the ancestral Puebloans in the southwest, all represent deep knowledge of local ecology, soil chemistry, water management, plant behavior accumulated through centuries of practice and transmitted across generations. These were not primitive people blindly scratching the ground. They were skilled agriculturalists working with an understanding of their specific environments exceeding what modern industrial agriculture has developed in many ways, because industrial agriculture has the luxury of ignoring long-term sustainability for short-term productivity. Pre-Columbian agricultural systems were by and large designed to last. The fact many were ultimately overwhelmed by environmental challenges does not diminish that achievement. It was the combination of specific climatic events, population pressures, and political stresses, not inherent fragility, that caused most collapses. There is another dimension of pre-Columbian North American civilization deserving sustained attention: the question of political organization. One of the most persistent myths about pre-Columbian North American peoples is that they lacked political organization beyond the small band or simple tribe, with no states, governments, or institutions of the kind associated with complex political life. This myth is wrong in important and interesting ways. The most famous counterexample is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the political alliance of the Iroquois nations uniting the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca peoples in what is now upstate New York, later adding the Tuscarora to create a six-nation confederacy. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, the constitutional framework governing the Confederacy, was a sophisticated political document addressing governance, conflict resolution, individual rights, and relationships between member nations with sophistication not addressed in most contemporary European political thought. The influence of the Great Law of Peace on the political thinking of the American founders is a matter of historical debate, but there is substantial evidence that at least some founders were aware of the Haudenosaunee model and drew on aspects of it in their thinking about federalism and representative governance. The Confederacy itself was a functioning political institution that successfully managed relations between multiple sovereign nations for centuries before European contact, demonstrating remarkable resilience and adaptability under colonial pressures. But the Haudenosaunee were not unique in political sophistication. The Powhatan Confederacy of the Chesapeake was a complex political entity, as discussed. The various confederacies of the Creek and Cherokee peoples in the Southeast were elaborate political institutions with their own constitutional frameworks and decision-making procedures. The political systems of the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest, with their complex arrangements of clan, moiety, and ceremonial society governance, were sophisticated and effective in managing community life across multiple villages and subgroups. The Mississippian chiefdoms were hierarchical political entities capable of commanding tribute, organizing labor, managing trade networks, and projecting military power over wide territories. They were not states in the European sense, but they were not simple kin-based bands either. They were complex polities with institutionalized authority structures, hereditary aristocracies, ceremonial systems legitimizing political power, and administrative capacities extending well beyond informal consensus. The diversity of political forms in pre-Columbian North America is itself an important point. These were not all the same kind of society. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was very different from a Mississippian chiefdom, which was very different from a Hohokam irrigation community, which was very different from the Chacoan system of the Southwest. Pre-Columbian North America was a continent of enormous cultural and political diversity, in which different societies developed different solutions to the fundamental problems of organizing collective life, managing resources, resolving conflicts, and transmitting knowledge and authority across generations. That diversity was itself one of the strengths of the pre-Columbian world, meaning knowledge and solutions developed in one part were available through trade and communication networks to communities in other parts, allowing intellectual and technological cross-pollination, driving innovation across the entire system. The flattening of that diversity through colonization, the reduction of hundreds of distinct political traditions to a handful of surviving fragments, was not just a human tragedy, but an intellectual and civilizational loss of enormous proportions. There is a lake in Minnesota called Lake Itasca, conventionally identified as the source of the Mississippi River, a quiet, pine-fringed lake in the northern part of the state, one of the most visited sites in the Minnesota State Park system. Tourists come to stand in the shallow headwaters and feel the water of the Mississippi flowing over their feet. It is a beautiful place, and the sense of connection to one of the continent's great geographic and cultural axes is real. But I want to suggest thinking about Lake Itasca slightly differently than most visitors do, because the Mississippi River system, the great drainage basin encompassing roughly 40% of the contiguous United States, and the central geographic fact of North American history since the continent was first peopled, was also the central artery of the pre-Columbian civilizational world we have been discussing. Poverty Point sat on a tributary at the southern end of the Mississippi system. Watson Brake sat in the same region. Cahokia sat right on the river's edge, at roughly its midpoint. The Hopewell culture flourished in the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi's largest eastern tributary. The mound-building traditions of the Midwest and Southeast were all in one way or another river valley civilizations, using the rich alluvial soils of river bottoms for agriculture, using the rivers themselves as highways for trade and communication, using the great rivers as the structural framework within which their political and ceremonial systems developed. When you look at a map of the Mississippi and its tributaries and overlay the distribution of major pre-Columbian mound-building sites, the relationship is immediately apparent and overwhelming. The rivers were the roads of pre-Columbian North America, and the greatest concentrations of civilizational achievement were where the rivers converged and crossed. Cahokia's location at the confluence of the Missouri and Illinois, just upstream from the confluence of the Ohio, giving it access to essentially the entire interior drainage of the continent, was not accidental. It was strategically brilliant. A city at that location could receive goods from the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachians, the Great Lakes, and the Gulf Coast with equal ease because the rivers connected all those places to each other and to the American bottom. That is exactly what the archaeology shows happened. Cahokia was the hub of the most extensive trade network in pre-Columbian North America, drawing in materials and people from across a continental territory and redistributing influence and ideology outward in return. The rivers made that possible. And the rivers, in a very real sense, made American civilization possible both before and after European arrival. The Ohio River was the highway of westward expansion for American settlers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries for exactly the same reasons it had been the highway of Hopewell expansion 2,000 years earlier. The geography that shaped pre-Columbian civilization shaped colonial civilization too, because geography does not change just because the culture inhabiting it changes. The land has its own logic, persisting across whatever human dramas are played on its surface. Here is something very few people know about the pre-Columbian history of North America, sitting at the intersection of archaeology and ecology, changing how researchers think about the deep history of the continent's landscapes. Before European contact, the forests of eastern North America were fundamentally different from the forests Europeans encountered, and modern ecologists often took as their baseline for what natural forest in this region looks like. The difference was not simply climate or natural forest succession. It was deliberate human management. Indigenous peoples of eastern North America practiced landscape management through controlled fire on a massive scale over a very long time period, creating and maintaining open park-like woodlands with significant grassy understories far more productive for game animals and human food plants than the dense, closed canopy forests developing after European contact. The park-like quality early European explorers frequently described, the impression of a landscape looking almost like a managed garden, was not illusion but accurate observation. The landscape really did look that way because it had been managed to look that way through centuries of careful burning suppressing undergrowth, maintaining open grassy areas, encouraging mass-producing trees like oaks and chestnuts, and creating habitat conditions favoring the deer, turkey, and other game animals on which the region's human population depended. When European settlement disrupted this management by displacing or killing its practitioners, the forest changed. The dense undergrowth early settlers constantly complained about was not a natural condition. It was what happens when you stop burning. The eastern forests 19th century naturalists described as primeval, serving as the reference condition for much Eastern ecological restoration thinking, were not primeval at all. They were forests that had lost their managers and reverted to a condition pre-Columbian peoples would not have recognized as the forests of their homeland. This finding has enormous implications for ecological restoration and the relationship between human management and natural systems, suggesting the distinction between wilderness and managed landscape that European thinking has usually taken as fundamental is, in the case of eastern North America, largely false. The eastern woodlands were wilderness in the sense they were not organized along European lines of private ownership and agricultural cultivation, but they were not unmanaged. They were managed skillfully and sustainably by people who understood them in ways European settlers did not, and mostly could not, because the knowledge required had been developed and refined over millennia, embedded in cultural practices and ecological knowledge traditions disrupted, and in many cases destroyed by the colonial encounter. The restoration of that ecological knowledge where possible is now recognized by many ecologists and land managers as one of the most important tools available for managing complex ecological challenges of the 21st century American landscape. The indigenous peoples of North America were not just victims of ecological change. They were in many cases the original ecological engineers of the landscapes now constituting the United States, and their knowledge and management traditions are directly relevant to environmental challenges we face today. Let us spend some time with the most ancient layers of this history. The periods before the cultures we have been discussing, before the Hopewell and Cahokia and Chaco, before even Poverty Point and Watson Break, in the deep prehistory of North American occupation, because the story of the first Americans, how they got here, when they arrived, what they found, and what happened in the first millennia of human occupation of the continent, is one of the most actively debated and rapidly changing areas of American archaeology. For most of the 20th century, the standard story was the Clovis first model. The first humans entered the Americas from northeastern Asia, crossing the Bering Land Bridge into Alaska around 13,000 years ago, then moving rapidly south through a newly opened ice-free corridor east of the Rocky Mountains into the heart of the continent. These first Americans, the Clovis people, named for a distinctive type of fluted spear point first found near Clovis, New Mexico, were supposed to be the ancestors of all indigenous peoples of the Americas. The Clovis first model had elegance and evidence of a distinctive, widespread tool technology. Clovis points have been found across a huge territory of North and South America, associated with mammoth and other megafauna, remains suggesting a pattern of big game hunting consistent with a rapidly expanding population moving through a previously unpopulated landscape. But the Clovis first model has been under sustained challenge for decades, and by now it is clear it is wrong, or at least incomplete. Sites in South America, most notably Monte Verde in Chile, have produced evidence of human occupation dating to 14,000 years ago or more before the Clovis horizon in North America. The math does not work for a Clovis first entry. If people were in southern Chile 14,000 years ago, they must have arrived earlier than 13,000 years ago and traveled through environments and by routes the Clovis first model does not account for. The most widely accepted alternative is the coastal migration model. The first Americans moved south along the Pacific coast during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were low enough to expose coastal shelves providing habitable land and abundant marine resources all the way from Beringia to the southern tip of South America. This model accounts for early dates in South America and is consistent with evidence of early maritime technology in other parts of the Pacific world at the same period. It also predicts that archaeological evidence for these earliest coastal migrants is largely on the seafloor, explaining why it is so hard to find. There are hints of pre-Clovis occupation at a number of sites across North America. Sites producing dates older than 13,000 years and artifacts suggesting human presence before the Clovis horizon. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania has produced dates some researchers read as suggesting occupation around 16,000 years ago. The Deborah L. Friedkin site in Texas has produced pre-Clovis artifact assemblages. Bluefish Caves in the Yukon have produced evidence of possible human activity as early as 24,000 years ago. None of these pre-Clovis claims is without controversy, and debate continues, but the cumulative weight suggests people were in the Americas at least in some locations earlier than the Clovis first model allows. Genetic evidence from ancient DNA analysis of archaeological remains and modern indigenous populations is increasingly consistent with a scenario of multiple migrations into the Americas at different times through different routes, producing the complex pattern of genetic and cultural diversity characterizing pre-Columbian North America. The deep prehistory of the continent is still being written. Every new excavation, every new application of ancient DNA analysis to early American skeletal remains, every new dating of coastal shelf sediments adds pieces to a puzzle far more complex than the simple Clovis first model suggested. That complexity is appropriate. The Americas are a vast territory. Their colonization by the ancestors of the continent's indigenous peoples was not a single event, but a long, complex, multi-stage process unfolding over thousands of years, producing one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse regions on the planet. The continent European explorers reached in the late 15th century was home to hundreds of distinct languages, dozens of distinct cultural traditions, and an enormous variety of social and political forms, all the product of thousands of years of separate development, migration, trade, conflict, and synthesis. It was not a simple place. It was one of the most complex human environments on Earth. There is a rock formation in the Black Hills of South Dakota the Lakota people know as Bear Butte, a sacred site for numerous Plains Indian peoples for many centuries. It is a laccolith, a dome of igneous rock pushed up through surrounding sedimentary layers, creating a prominent natural landmark visible for miles across the flat plains. But the deeper significance of Bear Butte is not its geology. It is its role in the ceremonial and spiritual geography of the Plains peoples as a place of vision quests, prayer, connection to the spirit world, gathering, and renewal. Bear Butte is a place made sacred by centuries of human attention, by prayers, offerings, and ceremonies accumulated across generations, by the stories people tell and the experiences they have there. It is, in the language of contemporary landscape archaeology, a cultural landscape feature, a place whose significance is primarily the product of human meaning-making rather than natural properties. And Bear Butte is not unique. The pre-Columbian landscape of North America is full of such places. Sites sacred, significant, deeply meaningful to the peoples who inhabited them, visited, maintained, and returned to over long periods. Some we know about because they have been documented ethnographically through conversations with indigenous peoples whose traditions maintain memory of their significance. Others we can identify archaeologically through concentrations of offerings and patterns of visitation. Others, probably many, we have no way of identifying because knowledge of their significance died with the communities that held it in the demographic catastrophe of the colonial period. The sacred landscape of pre-Columbian North America was as complex and culturally layered as the physical landscape. Of earthworks, great houses and canal systems, every mountain, river, unusual rock formation, and place where unusual things happened or were believed to happen was potentially a node in a web of sacred geography, giving meaning to the landscape and structuring the relationship between human communities and the land they inhabited. The loss of that sacred geography, the severing of those meaning-laden relationships between people and place, was one of the deepest wounds of colonization, severing people from the landscape itself, from the accumulated meaning of thousands of years of human presence and attention. Healing that wound where possible requires not just the return of land, but the recovery or reconstruction of relationships, knowledge, and stories that make land more than real estate, that make it home. As this long night moves toward morning, I want to return one more time to the question running beneath all the specific sites and cultures and engineering achievements we have discussed. What it means that all this happened here on this continent, in this landscape we now call the United States. There is something particular about the American relationship to this history, different from the way other countries relate to their archaeological pasts. In Mexico, the pre-Columbian civilizations of the Aztec, Maya, Olmec, and dozens of others are central to national identity. The Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan is on the national coat of arms. The calendar stone is one of the most recognized images in the world. The ruins of Monte Alban, Palenque, and Chichen Itza are national treasures celebrated and maintained as expressions of a deep and remarkable heritage. In Peru, the civilizations of the Inca, Moche, Chavín, and Wari are similarly central. Machu Picchu is one of the most visited places in the world. The gold of the Chimu and textiles of the Paracas are displayed in great museums as masterpieces of human achievement. But in the United States, the equivalent sites, Cahokia, Newark, Chaco, Mesa Verde, Poverty Point, and the dozens of other extraordinary pre-Columbian places on American soil, occupy a much more marginal place in national consciousness. Cahokia gets a fraction of the visitors Chichen Itza gets, despite being a comparable site in historical significance and architectural achievement. The earthworks of the Ohio River Valley are unknown to the majority of Ohio residents, let alone the broader American public. Pre-Columbian history is not taught with depth and seriousness in American schools, and is not reflected in the national self-image with anything approaching prominence. Why? Reasons are complex and historically layered. Part is the specific ideological needs of American nationalism, requiring an empty or primitive continent to justify colonization and dispossession. Part is the nature of pre-Columbian civilizations, building in wood and earth rather than stone, leaving ruins less immediately spectacular to the untrained eye than stone pyramids of Mexico or carved temples of Peru. Part is the ongoing marginalization of Native American peoples and perspectives in American public life, meaning voices most effective at advocating for greater recognition are often those with least access to mechanisms of public education and cultural production. Part is simply the human tendency to value what we know best, and most Americans have never been taught to know this history well. but that is changing slowly, imperfectly, unevenly, but changing. The application of new technologies is revealing new details and new sites with increasing regularity. The academic literature on pre-Columbian North American civilizations has expanded enormously over the past generation. Popular books from Charles Mann's 1491 to Timothy Pocketat's work on Cahokia to the growing literature on Chaco and the Hopewell have reached wide audiences and shifted popular understanding. Voices of indigenous scholars and community members insisting on recognition of ancestors' achievements and relevance of their traditions to interpretation are increasingly heard. The picture is not yet where it should be. The story we have been telling tonight, Watson Break, Poverty Point, Cahokia, Chaco, Mesa Verde, Hohokam, Hopewell, is not yet the story most Americans learn in school or carry in their heads as understanding of the place they live. But the direction of change is clear, and the evidence supporting it is overwhelming. This history is real, documented, extraordinary, and it belongs to everyone who lives on this continent as a legacy of the human achievement that preceded everything that came after. The megastructures are still in the ground. The alignments are still in the sky. The questions are still open. The story is still being told. There is one more thing to say before the silence takes over completely. One more layer of this history deserving to be named and honored in this space of late-night reflection. The layer of continuity. Running through all the stories of rise, fall, collapse, and abandonment we have told tonight, there is also a story of survival. The descendants of the people who built Watson Break, Poverty Point, Cahokia, Chaco, and Mesa Verde did not vanish. They did not disappear into some prehistoric mist. They are alive, present here. The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona are living, practicing cultures whose continuity with the ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest is documented in the archaeological record, oral traditions, genetic evidence, and the living practice of kiva ceremonies, pottery traditions, and architectural forms connecting them directly to the builders of Chaco and Mesa Verde. The O'odham peoples of the Sonoran Desert live within and around the ruins of the Hohokam Canal system their ancestors built. The Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and dozens of other southeastern peoples are descended from the Mississippian civilization that built Cahokia and the platform mound communities of the southeast. The Haudenosaunee nations continue to maintain political institutions and cultural traditions with vitality and sophistication, reflecting deep history. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and dozens of other Plains peoples maintain relationships to the sacred landscape of the Great Plains, reflecting thousands of years of presence. The survival of these communities and maintenance of cultural and political institutions across 5 centuries of colonization, dispossession, and forced assimilation is itself one of the most extraordinary achievements in the story of pre-Columbian North American civilization. It is the continuation of that story, not its ending. The earthworks may be silent. The great houses may be ruins. The road systems may be invisible from the surface, but the people are still here. And the knowledge, fragmentary and damaged and in need of healing and restoration as it is still alive. The story of America's lost megastructures is not only a story of loss. It is also a story of persistence. The refusal of human communities to let their histories be entirely erased. The maintenance through all pressures and catastrophes of connections between present communities and past achievements. The insistence that these extraordinary places, earthworks, roads, cliff dwellings, great kivas, canal systems, are not merely archaeological curiosities, but are the physical manifestations of an intellectual and spiritual heritage still relevant, still living, still demanding to be known. And that is, in the end, the deepest reason to care about this history. Not because it is curious or remarkable, though it is both, but because it is true, and the truth of it matters for the people whose ancestors built these things, and for all the people who share this continent with their descendants, and who live on land carrying this history in its very soil. The land remembers. And when we are willing to listen to what the land remembers, we learn things about ourselves and about the human capacity for achievement, loss, and survival we cannot learn anywhere else. The stars above Chaco Canyon tonight are the same stars the Chacoans watched for centuries to build their road network and align their great houses. The moon rising over the Newark Octagon in Ohio follows the same 18.6-year cycle the Hopewell encoded into that earthwork 2,000 years ago. The Mississippi River flows past the mounds of Cahokia on its way to the Gulf with the same indifference to history it has always maintained toward the human dramas enacted on its banks. The desert of the Sonoran still holds in its dry soil the traces of the Hohokam canals, visible to radar if not the naked eye. The sandstone of Chaco Canyon is slowly eroding under wind and rain, taking with it the fine masonry some long-dead builder shaped with such care and precision 800 years ago. Time is working on all of it, but slowly, more slowly than the civilizations themselves could have imagined when they were building. The mounds of Watson Brake have persisted for 5,400 years. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde have been empty for 7 centuries and are still standing. The great houses of Chaco are ruins, but they are recognizable ruins, and the walls that remain retain something of the dignity and intention of the people who raised them. The land holds its history carefully, more carefully perhaps than we have held our obligation to know it. But we are learning, slowly, imperfectly, with all the limitations of distance and time, and the specific ways colonization disrupted knowledge transmission. We are learning what this continent was before we inherited it. We are learning to read the mounds, earthworks, alignments, ceramic traditions, trade networks, agricultural systems, and sacred landscapes as what they are. The record of sophisticated human civilizations that flourished on this ground for thousands of years before the arrival of the people whose descendants now fill its cities, farm its fields, and drive its highways without knowing. In most cases, they are driving across a landscape full of history. That history is patient. It has been waiting a long time to be known, and perhaps in some small way on this particular night we have paid it the attention it deserves. Sleep well. The mounds are patient, and so are the questions. And so, if you will let yourself be, are you. Let us go north, far north, into a territory most Americans think of as cold, remote, and historically thin, a place where civilization in the grand sense seems unlikely. Let us go to the Aleutian Islands, that long arc of volcanic rock stretching from the tip of the Alaska Peninsula southwest toward Kamchatka, and then to the coastline of southern Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, because the pre-Columbian history of this region contains some of the most remarkable and underappreciated civilizational achievements in North America. The Unangan people, known to most Americans as the Aleuts, have been living in the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula for somewhere between 9,000 and 10,000 years, making them one of the most ancient continuously occupied human settlements in the New World. In a landscape most modern people would consider almost unlivably harsh, cold, fog, violent storms, almost no terrestrial plant resources. The Unangan built a civilization sustaining itself for millennia on the extraordinary productivity of the marine environment. They were among the most skilled maritime hunters in history. Their bidarkas, small skin-covered kayaks, were engineering marvels, perfectly adapted to North Pacific conditions, highly maneuverable in rough seas, and capable of covering enormous distances. Unangan hunters and bidarkas pursued sea otters, sea lions, fur seals, and whales with harpoons designed over centuries to maximize effectiveness in Aleutian marine conditions. They developed hunting technologies and techniques so effective that Russian fur traders, when encountering the Unangan in the 18th century, immediately recognized the superiority of Unangan maritime technology and forced Unangan hunters to work for them, essentially enslaving the most skilled maritime hunters on Earth in service of the fur trade. But the Unangan were not simply hunters. They were a culturally sophisticated people with an elaborate artistic tradition, complex social organization, and deep knowledge of their environment going far beyond simple resource extraction. The elaborately decorated hunting hats of Onangan men, made from bent wood and decorated with sea lion whiskers, carved ivory, and seabird feathers, are among the most beautiful objects produced by any pre-Columbian culture in North America. They were also, like the astronomical alignments of Chaco and the earthwork geometries of Newark, simultaneously functional and symbolic. Specific decorations communicated information about the wearer's family, hunting achievements, and social status. While the hat itself was designed to reduce glare on the water while hunting, form, function, and symbol inseparable in Onangan material culture, as in material cultures across the continent. Further south, along the Pacific coast in what is now the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Canada, indigenous peoples developed what many researchers consider the most complex non-agricultural civilization in the world. The tribes of the Northwest Coast, including the Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, Kwakwaka'wakw, Nuu-chah-nulth, and many others, built societies of extraordinary cultural sophistication without agriculture, sustained entirely by the extraordinary productivity of the Pacific marine environment. The salmon runs of the Northwest Coast rivers were among the greatest natural food sources in the world. Enormous runs of 5 salmon species moving through rivers in regular seasonal patterns provided a protein source so reliable and abundant that communities could accumulate significant food surpluses without farming. Surpluses supporting social complexity and artistic production genuinely remarkable. The Northwest Coast peoples built permanent large villages of substantial cedar plank houses, created one of the most distinctive and sophisticated artistic traditions in the world, expressed in carved and painted forms of totem poles, house fronts, masks, bentwood boxes, and dozens of other forms. Practiced a ceremonial system centered on the potlatch, a feast where wealth was publicly given away, regulating resource distribution, validating social status, and reinforcing political relationships across communities. The wealth fueling these ceremonies came from the same marine environment sustaining Northwest Coast peoples for thousands of years, converted through skilled labor into dried fish and processed goods accumulated, traded, and given away in the competitive generosity of the potlatch. Northwest Coast oral traditions preserve genealogies and historical event records reaching many generations before European contact, providing a window into deep history unavailable for most pre-Columbian North American cultures. The complexity of kinship systems, detail of ceremonial protocols, sophistication of artistic traditions, all speak of long-developed cultural institutions with deep historical roots. These were not simple societies. They were among the most complex, culturally rich, and artistically productive societies in the pre-Columbian world. There is a place in the middle of the country in Kansas, not appearing on most lists of significant pre-Columbian sites, barely known outside a narrow circle of specialists, but deserving attention because it represents something important about pre-Columbian history of the Great Plains often overlooked. The site is called the Tobias Site, associated with a culture archaeologists call the Great Bend aspect or the Wichita ancestor tradition, a farming culture flourishing on the southern plains between roughly 1400 and 1700 AD. The site is not spectacular in the way Cahokia, Chaco, or Mesa Verde are spectacular. It does not have enormous earthworks, cliff dwellings, or a famous canyon setting. What it has is houses, dozens of circular earthen lodge structures arranged around an open plaza, housing a farming community of several hundred people growing corn, beans, and squash in rich bottomlands along the Arkansas River, hunting bison on the surrounding plains, and trading with communities to the south and east through networks connecting them to the broader Mississippian and Southern Plains cultural worlds. The Tobias site matters not for architectural grandeur, but for what it represents in the story of the Southern Great Plains. The standard historical narrative of the Great Plains tends to treat it as a region only sparsely occupied before European contact. a vast grassland roamed by nomadic buffalo hunters with no permanent settlements or complex social organization. This narrative is wrong. The southern and central Great Plains had a substantial farming population in centuries before European contact, concentrated along major river valleys where bottomland soils and water availability made corn agriculture possible. These farming communities were not primitive or simple. They were organized communities with permanent architecture, complex social structures, and participation in regional trade networks. They were, in short, part of the broader pre-Columbian civilizational world of North America, not an empty frontier beyond its edge. The transformation of the southern and central Great Plains into the bison hunting territory of nomadic peoples Europeans encountered in the 17th and 18th centuries was in large part the result of the same demographic catastrophe, reshaping the rest of the continent. Epidemic disease moving inland from coastal contact points devastated farming populations of river valleys before European explorers arrived to document them. The great bison herds characterizing the plains in the historic era were themselves partly a product of this demographic collapse. As hunting pressure farming peoples maintained on herds was removed and animal populations exploded. The adoption of the horse by plains peoples after Spanish horses escaped into the wild in the late 16th and early 17th centuries transformed the economy and culture of the region so rapidly and thoroughly that by the time American explorers encountered the plains in the 19th century, the equestrian nomadic buffalo hunting culture they found seemed primordial and ancient when it was in fact quite recent. A highly successful adaptation to the combination of demographic catastrophe and availability of a new technology. The deeper history of the plains, the farming communities along rivers, trade networks connecting them to the broader pre-Columbian world, complex social and political institutions developed over centuries of agricultural occupation, was hidden under the dramatic surface of the equestrian culture that replaced it. That deeper history is still being excavated, literally and figuratively, by archaeologists working along the river valleys of Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. And what they are finding consistently is more complexity than the standard narrative allows. There is a story told by the Hopi people of Arizona about the time before they came to their current home. The time of the migrations, when their ancestors traveled through many places and learned many things before they were ready to settle in the Mesa country where they live today. The migrations are a central element of Hopi cosmology, and the places ancestors visited during those migrations are marked across the landscape of the Colorado Plateau and beyond by spiral petroglyphs, the sign that a Hopi clan passed through and was acknowledged by the keeper of the land. When archaeologists first heard these migration stories and looked at the distribution of spiral petroglyphs across the Southwest, some dismissed them as myth. But more careful analysis has shown the spiral petroglyph distributions are real, corresponding in many cases to actual patterns of ancestral Puebloan population movement visible in the ceramic and architectural record. The migration stories are history, told in a different form than the kind of history archaeologists usually work with, but encoding real information about real events in real places. The relationship between oral tradition and archaeological evidence in pre-Columbian North American history is one of the most interesting and contested methodological issues in the field. For much of the 20th century, professional archaeologists treated oral traditions with skepticism as unreliable sources contaminated by mythological elaboration and too distant from events to be trusted as factual evidence. This skepticism was not entirely without basis. Oral traditions can endure change over time, incorporate mythological elements obscuring historical content, and be influenced by specific cultural and political needs of communities that maintain them. But wholesale dismissal was also wrong, in ways that had specific consequences for interpretation of the pre-Columbian record. Some of the most important corrections to archaeological interpretation of specific sites and cultures have come from taking oral traditions seriously as historical sources. The identification of biological relationship between modern Pueblo peoples and ancestral Puebloans, now confirmed by genetic evidence, was anticipated by Pueblo oral traditions maintaining continuity with cliff-dwelling ancestors. Interpretation of Cahokia has been enriched by attention to oral traditions of the Osage, the Dejihah Siouan-speaking peoples who may have direct historical connections to the Mississippian tradition. Understanding of Chaco has been deepened by engagement with oral traditions of Pueblo peoples maintaining connections to the canyon. The lesson is not that oral traditions should be accepted uncritically as literal historical fact. It is that they should be engaged with as serious historical sources, subjected to same critical analysis as any historical document. And when they often yield information archaeological evidence alone cannot provide. Access to the inside of historical process, to how people who lived through events understood, interpreted, and remembered them, different from and complementary to the outside view of material culture analysis. The dismissal of oral traditions was part of the broader colonial project of disqualifying indigenous knowledge and perspective. Reversing it is part of the broader project of decolonizing American history, producing a more complete and honest account of what happened on this continent before and during the European encounter. The Colorado River begins in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado and flows southwest through a landscape it has sculpted over millions of years into one of the most dramatic environments on Earth. The Grand Canyon, carved through a mile of rock over the past 5 to 6 million years, is the most famous of its works. But the Colorado River system also flows through the territory of the pre-Columbian ancestral Puebloan world, and the canyon country of the Colorado Plateau is among the most archaeologically rich landscapes in North America. For thousands of years, the canyons and mesas were home to a succession of cultures adapting to the specific challenges and opportunities of this extreme environment with extraordinary creativity and resilience. The basket maker cultures, ancestors of the ancestral Puebloans, were living in canyon country as early as 1,500 years before the Common Era. Hunter-gatherers gradually incorporating corn agriculture into their subsistence system and developing distinctive material culture traditions, including the exceptional basketry, giving them their archaeological name. The early basket maker sites are humble by later standards, shallow pit house villages, modest ceramic assemblages, evidence of a subsistence economy still heavily dependent on hunting and gathering. But already there are hints of astronomical awareness and symbolic sophistication characterizing the later ancestral Puebloan tradition. Rock art panels associated with basket maker sites show sun watchers, figures with sun symbols, marks of people already attending carefully to movements of the sky. Over following centuries, the basket maker tradition evolved into what archaeologists call Pueblo I and Pueblo II. Periods leading up to the fluorescence of the Chaco system. Population grew. Villages became larger and more permanent. Architecture shifted from pit houses to above-ground masonry structures. Ceramic tradition became more elaborate and regionally diverse. Evidence of astronomical awareness became more pronounced, with site orientations and specific architectural features encoding celestial alignments appearing at sites across the plateau. The Chaco fluorescence, discussed at length, represents the peak of this developmental trajectory. But after Chaco's collapse in the mid-12th century, the story does not end. Populations drawn into the Chacoan sphere moved and reorganized. The following century saw development of the cliff-dwelling tradition culminating at Mesa Verde and in canyon systems of southeastern Utah, as discussed. After Mesa Verde's abandonment around 1300, the story continued again, with ancestral Puebloan populations moving south and east into the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi and Zuni mesas, building Pueblo communities surviving today. Pueblo IV, from roughly 1300 to 1600 AD, saw construction of some of the largest and most architecturally sophisticated Pueblo communities. Sites like Arroyo Hondo, Tiwa, and Cuaua in the Rio Grande Valley, large multi-story compounds housing hundreds or thousands of people. The Kiva murals of Kuawa, painted in the 14th and 15th centuries, represent a pinnacle of pre-Columbian religious painting in North America, showing ceremonial traditions of the Rio Grande Pueblo peoples in elaborate and beautiful detail. And then in the mid-16th century, Spanish explorers arrived from Mexico. Francisco Coronado's expedition of 1540 to 1542 passed directly through the Pueblo world, encountering communities that were the direct descendants of the Chacoans and Mesa Verdeans, still practicing Kiva ceremonies, pottery traditions, and architectural forms connecting them across centuries to their ancestors. The contact was violent and exploitative. The Spanish demanded food and labor, using force when demands were not met. A series of conflicts culminating in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, in which Pueblo peoples expelled the Spanish from their territory for 12 years, the only successful large-scale revolt against European colonization in North American history. The Pueblo Revolt was organized and led by a Tewa religious leader from Oke Owenja named Pepe, coordinating resistance across dozens of Pueblo communities speaking multiple languages, using the Kiva network as organizational infrastructure. A remarkable achievement of political organization and strategic planning, carried out in secret against an adversary with superior military technology. And it succeeded. For 12 years, Pueblo peoples lived free of Spanish rule. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they came on different terms, and the relationship between Pueblo peoples and Spanish colonial authority was thereafter more negotiated and less overtly exploitative than before the revolt. The Pueblo people survived. Their communities persist today. Their cultural traditions, languages, ceremonial practices, architectural forms, pottery traditions, all the markers of the civilization that began with the basket makers 2,000 years ago and developed through the Chacoan fluorescence, cliff dwelling period, and great Rio Grande Pueblo communities. All of it survived, damaged and modified, and in some ways transformed by the colonial encounter, but not destroyed, not forgotten, not lost. As we come to the end of this night's journey, I want to leave you with a thought about what it means to inherit a landscape. Every person living in the United States today has inherited a landscape carrying within it the physical traces and cultural legacy of thousands of years of human occupation before their own community arrived. That inheritance is complex and not always acknowledged, but it is real. The roads following river valleys in the Midwest often follow routes first established by pre-Columbian peoples, moving through the landscape on the same logic that rivers and bottomlands provided the easiest paths through a forested continent. The agricultural landscapes of the Southwest are built in many places on or near agricultural infrastructure, Hohokam, and ancestral Puebloan farmers developed over centuries of careful environmental observation. The ecological communities of the eastern forests are the partially recovered remnants of landscapes pre-Columbian peoples managed through fire and selective harvesting for thousands of years before European arrival. The archaeological sites beneath parking lots, strip malls, and suburban developments are not irrelevant curiosities from a distant past. They are the physical record of the human history of the specific place where we live. They connect us, whether we know it or not, to a depth of time and a richness of human achievement the standard narrative of American history does not capture. Knowing this history does not obligate any particular political response, though it provides context for ongoing debates about land, sovereignty, and rights of indigenous peoples that would benefit from more historical depth than they usually receive. Knowing this history does not require guilt or despair, though it may require honest reckoning with the scale of what was lost in the colonial period and what responsibility the present has toward repair and recovery of what can still be recovered. What knowing this history does require is attention, the willingness to look at the landscape around you and ask what came before, the willingness to take earthworks, ruins, rock art, oral traditions, and archaeological evidence seriously as records of genuine human achievement. the willingness to let the full complexity of this continent's human history be present in your sense of where you live and what it means to live here. The mounds are still there. The roads are still in the ground. The alignments are still in the sky. The questions are still open. The people carrying these histories in their blood, traditions, and relationships to this land are still here, maintaining connections colonization tried to sever, insisting on the importance of what their ancestors built and thought and knew. They deserve to be heard, and the history they are keeping deserves to be known. Sleep well. The stars above you are the same stars every human being who has ever stood on this ground has looked up at and wondered about. The ground beneath you holds more history than any of us will ever fully know. The mystery of it all. The gorgeous, humbling, endlessly fascinating mystery of what human beings have done on this continent across thousands of years is as present in the air around you as the darkness itself. Let it be with you as you sleep. The megastructures endure, and so do the questions. Good night. There is a river in Ohio called the Scioto, flowing south through the heart of the state past modern Columbus and through the rolling hills of Ross County until it joins the Ohio River near Portsmouth. The Scioto Valley is one of the most archaeologically important landscapes in North America, and for most people driving along its banks today, it is simply a river, simply scenery, simply background to whatever else is happening in their lives. But the Scioto Valley was for centuries one of the great ceremonial heartlands of the Hopewell world, and the evidence of that centrality is written across its landscape in a way that becomes visible the moment you know what to look for. Chillicothe, the county seat of Ross County, sits near the center of the densest concentration of Hopewell earthwork sites in the entire region. Within a few miles of Chillicothe, there are more significant Hopewell sites than in any comparable area of the continent. High Bank Works, with its circle and octagon aligned to the lunar cycle in the same pattern as the Newark Earthworks 60 miles north, sits on the bluff above the Scioto just south of Chillicothe. Hopewell Earthworks, a complex of geometric enclosures including a large circle and square, sits on the bottomland just north of town. Mound City, now part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, sits just north of Chillicothe and contains the densest concentration of burial mounds and mortuary structures from which the most extraordinary collection of Hopewell ceremonial objects ever recovered was excavated in the early 20th century. Sipe Works, Liberty Earthworks, Shriver Circle, Frankfurt Works. The names accumulate, the sites cluster, all connected spatially and culturally in a pattern suggesting not a random scatter of independent communities, but a deliberately organized ceremonial landscape in which the placement of each earthwork complex was related to the others by geography and cosmological intention. The Scioto Valley Hopewell ceremonial landscape was a designed environment, not designed in the sense a single architect sat down and drew a plan for the whole thing, but designed in the sense decisions about where to build each successive earthwork complex were made with reference to the existing pattern, with awareness of what was already there and what the new addition would mean in relation to it. The landscape as a whole was the artwork, and each individual earthwork complex was a brushstroke in a painting covering hundreds of square miles. Walking through this landscape today with knowledge of what is there and what it meant is an experience that does something to your sense of scale very difficult to describe. You are inside an artwork, moving through a sacred geography deliberately constructed by human beings who cared intensely about the relationship between earth, sky, community, the dead, and the cosmos, expressing that caring in the only medium large enough to hold it, the land itself. And the land holds it still, 2,000 years later, waiting for the attention the scale of the achievement deserves. Let us spend a few moments with the question of what we mean when we say civilization, because it is worth examining that word carefully in the context of this history. The standard definitions of civilization in Western academic discourse have typically emphasized a cluster of features: writing, cities, monumental architecture, state-level political organization, surplus agriculture, social stratification, professional specialization. The civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, Greece, developed most or all of these features and have therefore served as the template against which other societies are measured. When pre-Columbian North American societies are measured against this template, most fall short in one or more criteria. The Hopewell had monumental architecture, trade networks, social stratification, and probably political organization, but no cities and no writing. The Mississippians had cities, monumental architecture, state-level political organization, and surplus agriculture, but no writing in the conventional sense. The Chacoans had monumental architecture, roads, astronomical sophistication, and a regional political economy, but no writing and no cities in the strict sense. The result has been that these societies are often described as complex or pre-state or chiefdom level, with the implication they somehow fell short of the civilizational threshold. But this way of measuring is problematic. It takes a particular historical trajectory, the trajectory of Old World Bronze Age civilizations, as the universal norm against which all other human social development is measured, treating specific features of that trajectory, writing, cities, states, as the only valid markers of civilizational achievement. This is historically and anthropologically unjustifiable. Writing is a technology for information storage and transmission. Oral tradition is also a technology for information storage and transmission. The fact oral traditions leave less durable physical traces does not mean they are inherently inferior as cognitive or cultural achievements. The Iliad and Odyssey were oral compositions preserved orally for centuries before written down. The Vedas were composed and transmitted orally for centuries, possibly millennia, before committed to writing. That pre-Columbian North American intellectual traditions were maintained orally rather than in writing tells us something about specific historical circumstances of those civilizations. It does not tell us they were less sophisticated or less worthy of the label civilization. Cities are one form of human settlement concentration. Dense village clusters connected by roads and trade networks are another. Platform mound centers surrounded by dispersed residential populations are another. The fact Cahokia organized its population differently from Babylon or Alexandria tells us something about Cahokia's specific environmental and social context. It does not tell us Cahokia was less of a city or less of a center of power and complexity. The definition of civilization should not be a checklist that pre-selects one historical trajectory as universal standard and judges all others deficient. It should be a description of the range of ways human beings have organized complex collective life. By that measure, the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America were civilizations. They organized complex collective life. They built monuments enduring for millennia. They developed intellectual traditions of genuine sophistication. They created beautiful and meaningful art. They managed their environment sustainably for centuries. They participated in continental-scale networks of exchange and communication. They were in every meaningful sense civilized. The failure to recognize them as such is not a failure of the evidence. It is a failure of the measuring stick. There is a moment in the archaeological literature on Cahokia that has always struck me as one of the most quietly devastating sentences in American archaeology. It comes from the work of Timothy Pocketat, a leading researcher on Cahokia, who observed that at the peak of Cahokia's power, the city was drawing in people from across a vast territory, migrants from hundreds of miles away arriving and settling. And within a few generations of Cahokia's abandonment, the descendants of those migrants were scattered back across the landscape, carrying with them the cultural forms and ideological commitments of the Cahokian world, seeding subsequent Mississippian cultures of the surrounding region. Cahokia did not just collapse, it exploded outward. Its ideas, institutions, and ceremonial forms traveled with its diaspora and shaped the subsequent history of the entire region. This is not how we usually think about the decline of pre-Columbian civilizations. We think of them as endings, collapses, losses, and they were losses. The specific achievements of Cahokia as a place, the great mounds, organized plazas, concentration of craft specialization, and ceremonial activity, were lost when the city emptied. But the ideas animating Cahokia did not disappear. They traveled, transformed, became part of the substrate on which subsequent civilizations grew. This pattern of transformation, rather than simple disappearance, is characteristic of pre-Columbian North American civilizational history more broadly. The Hopewell interaction sphere collapsed around 500 AD, but the cultural traditions the Hopewell participated in did not vanish. They transformed into successor cultures of the woodland period and eventually into the Mississippian tradition emerging several centuries later. The Chacoan system collapsed in the mid-12th century, but ancestral Puebloan tradition did not disappear. It contracted, reorganized, and eventually produced the remarkable Pueblo IV communities of the Rio Grande Valley. The Hohokam Canal system collapsed in the 14th and 15th centuries, but the O'odham peoples, descendants of the Hohokam, maintained cultural continuity with their ancestors' tradition in their own ways. Pre-Columbian North American civilization was not a collection of brief, isolated episodes of complexity, each ending and replaced by emptiness. It was a continuous, evolving, transforming story of human achievement on this continent spanning thousands of years, involving dozens of distinct cultural traditions and producing a legacy still present, still living in the indigenous communities that are the inheritors of all of it. The night is very deep now. The questions are quieter, or perhaps they have simply become part of the fabric of the darkness, woven into the silence between breaths. Let me tell you about one last thing before I let the dark have you entirely. There is a practice in some Pueblo communities called watching for the sun. An elder or designated sun watcher goes out each morning before dawn, climbs to a high place, and watches the horizon for the specific point where the sun will rise. The position of that sunrise relative to landmarks on the horizon tells the community what day of the ceremonial year it is, when planting ceremony should begin, when catching a dances should be held, when other ceremonial obligations fall due. It is an ancient practice, connecting the person doing it to all the sun watchers who have done the same thing from the same or similar vantage points for a very long time. The act is simple. A person stands on a high place in the dark before dawn and watches for the light to come. But the meaning is enormous. The act of keeping time for a community, of maintaining the connection between the human world and the cosmic calendar, of saying on behalf of everyone who depends on you, we know what day it is. We know where we are in the year. We have not lost track of the great cycles that govern our lives. The Hopewell people who aligned the Newark octagon to the lunar cycle were doing something conceptually related to what the Pueblo Sun Watcher does, keeping track of great cycles, saying, we know where we are in the wheel of time. We have built our understanding into the landscape, so that even if we forget, the land will remember for us. The Chacoans who oriented great houses to solstices and built the sun dagger at Fajada Butte were doing the same thing. The builders of Woodhenge at Cahokia who aligned cedar posts to the spring equinox sunrise over Monk's Mound were doing the same thing. Across thousands of years and hundreds of miles, the same impulse to know where you are in time, to encode knowledge in the permanent landscape, to say to whoever comes after, this is what we understood about the world, and this is how we kept track of it. There is something deeply moving about that impulse when you sit with it. It is not just practical, though it has practical dimensions. It is also an expression of the desire to belong to something larger than the individual human life, to say, the cycles of the sky are real and govern us, and we are not helpless before them because we understand them, and our understanding is written into the world around us in a form that will outlast any individual memory. That is what the megastructures of pre-Columbian North America are at their deepest level. Expressions of the human desire to be oriented in time and space, to belong to a cosmos that can be known and that responds to being known, to say to the sky and the earth, we see you, We have learned your patterns, and we have made our knowing permanent in the landscape of our home. The mounds, earthworks, roads, great kivas, cliff dwellings, and canal systems are all, in different ways, instruments of orientation, ways of knowing where you are, ways of saying, we are not lost. We know the cycles. We know the directions. We know the geography of the sacred. We are at home here on this earth, under this sky, in this particular place in the long turning of time. And that, finally, is what it means to lose these civilizations. Not just the engineering achievements, trade networks, artistic traditions, and agricultural systems. It means losing the orientation, the specific knowledge of how to be at home in a specific place and time that these civilizations accumulated over centuries and encoded into the landscape of their homeland. That knowledge is not entirely gone. It survives in the oral traditions, ceremonial practices, ecological knowledge, and sacred geographies of the indigenous communities who are these civilizations' descendants. But it has been damaged, and the work of repairing it is ongoing. The first step in that work, perhaps, is simply to know what was there, to know the names of the places and the achievements they represent, to know that 5,400 years ago someone on the lower Mississippi built an 11-mound complex aligned to the cardinal direction still there in the Louisiana earth today. To know that 2,000 years ago a people in the Ohio River Valley encoded the 18-year cycle of the moon into a geometric earthwork covering 4 square miles. To know that 900 years ago the largest city north of Mexico sat in the American bottom east of the Mississippi, and we have named it after a later people who had no connection to it, because we lost the name of the people who actually built it. To know these things is to begin to know the depth of what this continent holds, and what happened here before the history most of us were taught begins. And knowing it changes you in ways hard to articulate, but real. You become a little more careful in the landscape, more attentive to slight rises in fields, unusual alignments of natural features, patterns in the distribution of trees, stones, and soil colors that might reveal something old and intentional beneath the surface. You become more humble before the depth of human time on this continent. Less sure the history you were taught is the complete story. You become perhaps more curious, more willing to ask questions the standard narrative doesn't ask, more open to the possibility that the world you live in is stranger and richer and more layered with human meaning than any school textbook has ever captured. That curiosity is the best thing you can take from this night's journey. Not any specific fact, date, or site, though those matter too, but the habit of wondering, the habit of looking at the landscape and asking what came before, the habit of taking seriously the possibility that the ordinary ground beneath your feet has an extraordinary history, and that the story of that history is worth knowing. The megastructures are in the ground. The alignments are in the sky. The questions are still open. And the night is very still. And perhaps if you listen carefully enough in the silence between your own heartbeats, you can hear something very faint and very old. Not words, not music exactly, but something like the sound of thousands of years of human presence on this land. Still resonant, still here, still asking to be known. Good night. The mounds are patient, and so tonight are you. There is something we have not yet talked about that belongs in this story, something connecting the deep pre-Columbian past to the immediate present in a way that is both scientifically remarkable and personally resonant for anyone thinking carefully about where they live and what it means. The question of names. Most of the landscapes we have discussed tonight carry names assigned by European settlers and explorers who had no knowledge of or interest in the pre-Columbian history of the places they were naming. Monk's Mound at Cahokia is named for Trappist monks who farmed its lower terrace in the early 19th century, not for the people who built it. Poverty Point is named for the nearby Poverty Point Plantation, itself named for reasons having nothing to do with the extraordinary ancient site on its land. Chaco Canyon takes its name from the Spanish word for a kind of scrubby desert plant. The Hopewell culture is named for a 19th century Ohio farmer named Mordecai Hopewell, on whose property one of the key archaeological sites was excavated. A man with no connection whatsoever to the civilization bearing his name today. The Hohokam culture is somewhat better in this regard, as the name comes from the Owadam language and means something like those who have gone or those who are used up, a name the Owadam people themselves gave to the ancient ruins in their territory they recognized as the works of their ancestors. And the ancestral Puebloans, preferred term today for what was once called the Anasazi, takes its name from the living Pueblo people's self-identification. The naming of these sites and cultures by European and American researchers in terms reflecting intellectual and cultural assumptions of 19th century science rather than self-understanding of the peoples being named is a microcosm of the broader process of colonial knowledge production, shaping the way we understand pre-Columbian North American history. The effort to correct these names where possible, consulting with descendant communities, and using terms those communities prefer, is part of the broader project of decolonizing American archaeology and producing a more respectful and accurate account of the pre-Columbian past. But the names are also a reminder of how recently this history has been taken seriously as history. The farmers, settlers, and developers who built their lives on top of the greatest concentrations of pre-Columbian earthworks mostly did not know what they were building on top of, or if they had some awareness of the archaeological heritage beneath their feet. They did not consider it a serious constraint on their right to develop property as they saw fit. The losses to the archaeological record from agricultural plowing, drainage ditch digging, road and building construction, and utilities are incalculable. Entire site complexes documented in the early 19th century by observers like Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis, authors of the landmark 1848 work Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, no longer exist in the form they were described, if at all. Squire and Davis documented hundreds of earthwork sites across Ohio, Indiana, and neighboring states with remarkable precision and detail for their era. Comparing their descriptions and measurements to current state of sites is in many cases an exercise in mapping loss. But what remains is still extraordinary, and what remains is increasingly protected, increasingly studied with sophisticated tools of 21st century archaeology, remote sensing, and ancient DNA analysis, increasingly understood in its complexity and significance. The story of pre-Columbian North America is not finished. It is being actively written. Each new discovery, each new application of a new technique to an old question, each new conversation between archaeologists and indigenous communities whose ancestors built the sites being studied, adds something to the picture. The picture is incomplete and will always be incomplete, but it is growing, and the direction of growth is toward recognition of the depth and sophistication of what happened here before the history most of us were taught begins. That recognition, slow and imperfect as it is, matters for the accuracy of our collective self-understanding as a society built on a specific landscape with a specific history. For the indigenous peoples whose ancestors built these places and whose connection to them deserves to be honored rather than ignored. For the intellectual enterprise of understanding human beings, what we are capable of, what we have achieved across the full range of our history on every continent. And perhaps most immediately for the quality of the curiosity you carry into your own life, your own relationship to the landscape around you, your own sense of what it means to be here on this earth in this specific place. Inheriting a history that runs much deeper than the official version has usually acknowledged. The mounds are patient, the stars are old, the questions are inexhaustible, and the night for now is yours. And one more thing, quietly before the silence. The people who watched the moon from the Newark Octagon 2,000 years ago were not watching it because they had nothing better to do. They were watching it because the moon governed things that mattered deeply to them. The timing of ceremonies, the planting of crops, the movement of animals through the landscape, the calculation of time across seasons and years, and the longer cycles connecting generations to each other and to whatever understanding of the cosmos they had arrived at through centuries of careful observation and accumulated insight. The moon was not just a light in the sky. It was a clock, a calendar, a cosmological presence with a specific relationship to human life and human meaning. They took that relationship seriously enough to build by hand over years and decades a geometric earthwork complex covering 4 square miles, encoding the moon's 18-year cycle into the permanent landscape of their homeland. That seriousness is not primitive, it is profound. It reflects a relationship to the natural world and to the passage of time most of us in our screen-lit, climate-controlled, schedule-driven modern lives have lost almost entirely. We do not watch the moon rise. We do not know the lunar cycle with intimacy the Newark builders did. We do not feel, most of us, any particular relationship between our own lives and the great cycles of the sky. Perhaps that loss, that specific disconnection from rhythms governing human life for hundreds of thousands of years before the present, is part of what makes it so moving to encounter these ancient places and understand what they were built for. They remind us of something we have forgotten, something about the human capacity for sustained attention to the world, something about the desire to know where you are in time and space, and to make that knowing permanent, something about the relationship between the human community and the cosmos it inhabits. The mounds, earthworks, roads, cliff dwellings, and canal systems are not just archaeological sites. They are also, if you let them be, invitations. Invitations to pay the kind of attention to the world the people who built them paid. Invitations to notice rising and setting of moon and sun, to feel the turn of seasons, to ask what the landscape around you remembers that you have forgotten. The night is very quiet now. The questions are very still. Let the stars be with you as you sleep. And let the mounds be patient. They are very good at patience. They have had a long time to practice. Somewhere right now, under the same sky that has watched over every civilization on this continent for thousands of years, the mounds are waiting. The stones of Chaco are cooling in the desert night. The earthworks of the Ohio River Valley are holding their shapes in the dark. The ruins of Cahokia are sitting quietly at the edge of a city that does not know what it is sitting next to. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde are empty and patient and very old. All of it is still there. All of it is waiting. And the story of all of it is just beginning to be properly known. That is not nothing. That is in fact everything. Sleep well. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.